He gave his kingdom absolute protection, an unbreakable barrier that stopped every threat, but peace made him useless and cast him out. Stripped of his title, his home, and even his fiancée, he wandered with nothing but his magic. Yet his so-called useless power is actually unstoppable. Now, dragons, beauties, and demons alike seek him out. Will the man they exiled become the wall the world can never cross? Let's find out. The story begins with the city's residents looking at the barrier in horror. The man shouted, "Look." Another added, "Let him run away or he will die." Meanwhile, the protagonist was walking through the city, eating an apple, looked and said, "Wow, what a big guy." The inhabitants raised their hands and a man shouted for them to erect a barrier. Another shouted, "This will not stop the barrier. It is about to collapse." At that moment, the protagonist saw boulders flying at the cat and hurried to save it. The woman looked in fear and asked why this barrier is so huge. The man shouted, "The only one who can create a barrier is the court mage." Then one of the villagers saw Shield busy saving the cat and yelled, instead of saving the cat, he should help the people first. A woman standing nearby agreed and yelled, "That's it." Someone from the crowd supported him. "That's right." The protagonist turned and asked what they were talking about. He was already saving them. The best defense is a good offense. Previously, they were standing in a beautiful hall. He was smiling. The people were clapping their hands and shouting, "Congratulations on your engagement, Shield-san. Congratulations." He thanked everyone for coming. She held his hand, smiled and said, "Shield-san." He asked, "What is it, Elaine?" She closed her eyes and said, "No, it looks like today will be a very fun day." He said that she was right. She looked at him mysteriously. He shouted, "From now on," but before he could finish, someone shouted, "Shield Rayaris." Suddenly the people parted and soldiers walked towards him. He said in surprise, "What?" He came closer to him and said, "Shield Rayaris. He is banishing him from the country on suspicion of plotting a coup d'etat." The protagonist said in surprise, "What?" Then he screamed. He did nothing of the sort. This is some kind of mistake, a trap. He handed him the papers and said, "This is not a mistake. They found evidence in his house." He asked, "In his house?" Suddenly she apologized to him. The protagonist turned to her and asked, "Elaine?" She looked down, raised her hand to her chin, and added, she was sorry that she entered his room without permission, but she was worried about what he did at night. And when she entered, she found that. He looked at her and asked, what was she talking about? Was he set up? Why? His barrier magic protected this country from invasion by other countries, monsters, and now he was being banished? This was absurd. He asked, "Did the king know yet?" The warrior agreed. Then he added, even if the king was involved in this, he had nothing more to say. The protagonist headed for the exit, turned around and asked, would he be given severance pay? He asked, was he joking? The protagonist waved his hand and said goodbye. He laughed and shouted, he was right. After a while, he was riding in a carriage, tears streaming down his face, looking out the window and thinking, he can't believe it. He didn't do anything to make enemies, but he never interfered in politics. Yes, he led a dissolute life, and recently many noble ladies were courting him. It was so tiresome. How did this happen? By the way, even when they announced their engagement, he said that he was going to marry a very beautiful woman. Some people looked at him with disdain. Wasn't it already his imagination? But he didn't do anything wrong. On the contrary, he lived his life with diligence and dedication. Although he was despised for using low-level magic, the only thing he knew was barrier magic, so he continued to hone it to perfection. He continued to perfect it, and before he knew it, he became the best barrier mage in the country. However, the barrier he set up around the country, he was banished, because they already have a plan for when it disappears. It's probably reaching its limit right now. The protagonist then looked out the window and thought, he explained to them that it wasn't eternal, didn't he? Or not? Then he screamed, but it doesn't matter anymore. Sometime later, he was walking through the city, carrying a bag of apples he bought at the market, and said, all he could take with him was some money and a gold pocket watch. The southern city of Minant is the most prosperous. It seems like a good place to start over. He was not comfortable in the land of northern beasts. The dragon forest to the east is too dangerous to cross, and in the west he will end up back in the capital. He picked up the bag and said, he thinks he will go south, but first. Then he went into a tavern, ordered food, closed his eyes and shouted, he needs to eat first. He ate meat, washed it down with wine, closed his eyes in pleasure and said, maybe exile is not so bad. Then he heard a rumble, but he ignored it and continued eating. 3 people were sitting behind him and watching. Afterwards, he left the tavern, waved to the owner and thanked her. 3 cloaked knights came out and followed him. He saw them out of the corner of his eye. Later, in one of the alleys, he turned to them, folded his arms and said they had been watching him all this time. Then he asked, what do they want? They prepared to attack, and one of them apologized and said that he would die here. The protagonist noticed that it seemed that they were not going to solve problems by talking. So it was even better. He smirked, swung his arm, took a stance, and prepared to attack. The protagonist looked and thought that this stance was familiar to him, then raised his hand and asked, are they from the knightly order? Shield closed his eyes and said, barrier, weapon destruction. At that moment all 3 were left without weapons. The magic worked. After that, he raised both hands, apologized and added, but his specialty is barrier magic. He raised his hand, smiled and said, this was to be expected, but what will he do against this magic? The preparations are already complete. At that moment, everything around the protagonist began to rise up. He asked, gravity magic? Since he activated it, he will use it too. And he said, magic barrier, reflection. Then the stones began to fly towards the three. From the impact of the stones, they fell to the ground. The protagonist watched the scene and said, he can only use defensive barrier magic, although it may seem otherwise. He achieved his position in the court solely thanks to barrier magic. The knight said, he heard that he was just an ordinary barrier mage. The protagonist asked, can he imagine that this is what they said about him, and who hired them? He then sat up and answered that he cannot say. The protagonist added, the moment he reflected the magic, it became his. It will not end until he decides to turn it off. However, it does not matter. He is the leader of the knights, then let him tell. Are there others like him? He only needs to know this. He replied, now that they have failed, others will come. It seems that someone really wants to kill him so that he does not get his position back. The protagonist snapped his fingers, smirked and said that he understands, and asked, is that all? The only thing he is good at is defense, and he will always be able to stand up to someone like him. Anyway, he will not be able to land a single blow on him even in his life. He stood up, looked at him and noticed, so this is the strength of the court magician. Afterwards, they bowed to him and hurried away. The protagonist looked ahead and said, well then. He raised his hand to his chin and thought, all the ways to secretly stay in the country are now completely closed. The south is the safest option, but that is why his pursuers can get ahead of him. The situation will be the same in the north, won't it? In that case, he will have to go to the east, although he least wanted to. They say that the road is full of insects. He raised his hands up and shouted that he swears, the captain of the knightly order, he will get to him. If even one insect lands on his shoulder, he will destroy it. He turned around and said, insect? Thank God, for now, but before he could finish speaking, it fell on his shoulder. He rushed to run and screamed, no. He began to ask for help. Suddenly he stopped, looked up and saw a dragon not far from him, looked at it in surprise, then closed his eyes, smiled and said, it's just a dragon. The protagonist turned around, waved his hand and was about to leave, when he heard a voice that asked, is he ignoring him? He began to turn his head from side to side, and thought in surprise, the voice, where is it from? Then he raised his head, looked, the dragon shouted back, from here. Shield asked, can he speak human language? Is he really a dragon? The dragon looked at him and introduced himself. Bahamut, a representative of the strongest species. It's funny that he doesn't know him, a human. Now he became interested. Will he eat him? The protagonist did not agree and asked, please. At this time, the dragon flew towards him, and the protagonist stretched out his hands forward and said, barrier, physical reflection, and the magical power pushed the dragon away. He tried again, but to no avail. The dragon said in surprise, his attack, was it reflected? The protagonist replied that he had reflected it with a barrier. He got angry, exclaimed, how is that possible? And flew at the protagonist again. He raised his hand again and said, barrier, physical reflection, and the dragon once again failed. MC raised his hand, looked up and noticed he was thrown quite far. Then he looked to the side and thought, this, and at that moment the dragon was approaching him, shouting, why can't it destroy the advanced magic of an ordinary person? The protagonist noticed, this is a barrier. If it could be broken, it wouldn't be a barrier, right? The dragon yelled, what? Just barrier magic? How can such simple magic be so powerful? The protagonist closed his eyes and replied, he had been perfecting barrier magic for 10 years. No wonder he reached this level. He worked hard and persistently, friend. The dragon got angry. A clot of magma was visible from its mouth. It screamed, this is impossible. It can't be that it doesn't have a weak spot. The protagonist raised his hand again and said, barrier, physical reflection. He thought, it's better to keep the barrier ready. At that moment, the dragon attacked. The protagonist held back the attack and thought, it looks like a beam of light, but in fact it is a substance resembling magma. In that case, he said, barrier, reflection of magic. The dragon flew over the protagonist and couldn't attack. It was indignant, an ordinary person, and disappeared. The protagonist thought, it turns out that even the most powerful kind of dragons are quite weak. Perhaps this only confirms how terrifying their own strength is. Well, he will follow the path that the dragon paved for him. He walked, clots of magma were smoking nearby. The protagonist thought, this looks more like a natural disaster than magic. So this is what it means to get caught in a rain of magma. No wonder even the dragon couldn't withstand it. Suddenly, he saw a girl next to him. She raised her hand and said, oh, what a mess, then called him, said he was very strong. The protagonist was very surprised and asked who she was. She answered, it was her, Bahamut, then stood up, closed her eyes and said, it has been a long time since she took human form, but will it do? He shouted, Bahamut, that huge dragon? She agreed and added, she took human form with magic. He turned away, covered his eyes with one hand, held the other out in front of him and asked, could she put something on? She answered, right, humans are like that, okay, no problem. Then snapped her fingers, and in that same second she was already standing in a dress. He looked at her and asked, she was in the forest, could she choose other clothes? She answered that he should not ask too much. He continued, however, it did not matter. She said, for the first time she could not eat a person. He looked funny, so she would go with him. He walked, turned around and asked, does she know the way? She answered, of course. The protagonist raised his hand and said, they need to go. He was already bored of being alone. She answered that he should go ahead. She needed to prepare something. Hearing such an answer, he turned and looked at her in surprise. She looked at him maliciously and said, it's too late. He was too careless. Then she came up to him and tried to bite him on the back. He turned around, apologized and said, it didn't work, did it? He always has an invisible barrier. She exclaimed, damn. And he stretched out his hand and said, barrier, physical reflection. At that moment she flew away. After she got up, he said that they need to go. She agreed and ran after him. He raised his hands to his head and said that he was hungry. After a while, she called him, pointed her hand to the side and loudly said, this is the wrong road. He turned aside too quickly. He smiled and asked, is that true? Then he added, oh, since she knew the way so well, she should lead the way. She clenched her fists and smiled maliciously. He added that he saw no point in her walking behind him. She wasn't going to eat him. Then he opened the bag of apples and asked, by the way, were they almost in town yet? She said, not at all. He added that she shouldn't lie. They would soon run out of supplies, thanks to someone who had eaten a week's supply of delicious provisions. She noted that she hadn't eaten them because they tasted good. She closed her eyes and continued, it had been centuries since she had tasted human food, so this was new to her. Compared to fresh blood, the soup was passable. He told her not to drool while she said this and asked her, Bahamut was too long a name, didn't she have another one? She replied, centuries ago she was called Faye. The protagonist said that he would call her Faye then too. She replied as he liked. They were walking along the road, and he asked her why she and the other dragons didn't attack cities. She replied because humans were not tasty, and they fought back, which was too much trouble. He smirked and said, I see. Anyway, they should hurry up. He wanted to take a bath already. She shouted, this is the wrong road. And at that time, someone was watching them from behind the trees. He thought, by the way, they didn't meet any other dragons or even their minions, so this is the power of the self-proclaimed strongest dragon race? MC looked at her and thought, although Faye is useful in some ways, it's annoying as hell when she watches him while he's busy with his own business. He turned to her and asked, what's wrong? She replied, nothing, and asked, is this a city? He shouted, this is Aegon. Later, they were walking along the streets of the city. He looked around and exclaimed, this is definitely a prosperous city, just like the rumors said. The protagonist closed his eyes, raised his hands up and shouted, what a wonderful city. He will take on the adventurer's quest and live here happily. His second life begins here. A little earlier, they were walking along the road, and she said, he did not even scratch him. How is it that he can barely cope with these weaklings when he was able to defeat her? He agreed and shouted that he was weak. He already told her that he can only use barrier magic. She is strong. She's a great dragon. She can figure it out herself. She folded her arms across her chest and asked what she should do if they run away when they see her. He yelled, in addition to being weak, he has little knowledge and is also terrible at collecting herbs. And it is only his fault. He fell to his knees and thought, an adventurer who can't even defeat these weaklings, his second life is ruined. At that moment, a watch fell out of the bag. He picked it up and thought, it seems he found a valuable thing. Later, they entered a luxurious house. The Count extended his hand and exclaimed, welcome, Shield Rayar-san and his companion Faye-san. The protagonist replied, Count Albert, and thanked him for the invitation. It is an honor for him. He replied that on the contrary, it was an honor for him. The court magician himself had arrived in this mansion as a mentor. Then he continued. He entrusted his daughter to him and asked them to go further. The Count walked ahead, and she said that he was behaving strangely. Is he always like this? The protagonist replied, his behavior does not matter. Only survival is important. The Count raised his hand and said that first they should have dinner. She asked, they say his daughter is a genius magician. Is it true? He replied that it was true that he had become a court mage, but he could only use barrier magic. What should he do if she asked him to teach her other spells? And anyway, what was she looking at with such hungry eyes while they were talking? They reached the dining room. The Count pointed with his hand and said, this way. The main character's brain immediately ran away from what he saw. He shouted at Faye to eat as much as she could. She said loudly, of course. Her decision to follow him was finally starting to pay off. At that moment, they simply pounced on the food. The Count watched, smiled and said, Shield-san, what a greedy manner of eating he has, but he wanted to talk about his daughter. At that moment he handed him an empty plate and shouted, it's delicious, he wants more. The Count agreed. The protagonist shouted, he has no time to worry about etiquette, he's dying of hunger. At that time the girl entered the room, folded her arms and watched them. He looked and thought, what an impressive amount of magic. Is this the Count's daughter? She has so much magic power that he has nothing to teach her. This is bad. He will have to eat until he is full before he is fired. Later, they were sitting opposite each other, and he thought, the time for his dismissal has come. The Count turned to his daughter and introduced, Amelia, this is Shield-san and Faye-san, her new mentors. Let her rejoice. They were none other than the court magicians of the kingdom of Helena. They have come to their mansion to reveal their talent. She closed her eyes, raised her hand and said loudly, Father! She was touched. He was so kind that she had tears in her eyes. He was happy and shouted, isn't it? What a joy. Let her study with them properly. Then he headed for the exit and remarked, it is time for him to go. Let her study hard. She waved her hand at him and agreed. Then the door slammed behind the count, and the protagonist said he was glad to meet you. She turned around and said, okay, now let him tell her the whole truth about himself. If he does, he won't get into trouble. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant. They are the court magicians of the kingdom of Helena, and they will be her mentors. Amelia sat cross-legged, holding a cup in her hands, smirked and said, look, this pocket watch looks genuine. Did you find it or buy it somewhere? Father is kind, and if he finds out you are imposters, he will blame himself for being deceived. If you don't want to get into trouble, she suggested that they tell her the whole truth. He thought about it and asked, the whole truth then? He continued, does she see that huge barrier covering the kingdom of Helena? She replied, of course, this sacred barrier is known throughout the continent. He scratched the back of his head and said, the whole continent? How awkward. She asked why he was embarrassed. He replied that he had created it. She was surprised by his answer. She knew that the 10 court magicians of Helena were the pinnacle of magical art in a country with a population of over 10 million people. She should not use this title lightly. In these lands, it carried special weight because they were revered as sacred magicians. She looked at him and told him to try again. If he dared, she would make him feel the weight of her words. One day, she would become a court magician too. She had no time for chatter. He looked at her and thought, the truth is, Amelia had a magical aura similar to theirs. Then he clarified. He said he was one of the 10 magicians. She smirked and asked, was he still continuing this farce? If he really was a court magician, why did he live in such deprivation? He replied that he was exiled for creating the very barriers she had just seen. She said, he's obviously become a political liability. He's lying terribly. No country would banish their hero. He screamed, that's it, but damn, it's true. She fixed her hair and screamed. Talking to him irritates her. He should stop talking nonsense and get out of here. He replied that he can't. He came here to work, then turned and asked, really, Faye? And asked her to say something. She asked in surprise, why should she convince this grumpy girl? He said indignantly, now she's talking like that after just eating her fill? In any case, she's not going to take lessons from her, just so he doesn't interfere with her practice and stays quiet in the corner. She followed him and thought, well, at least she'll watch her. That's the only thing she can do. In the meantime, they arrived at the courtyard. The protagonist looked and thought, this magic doll is very worn out. He's never seen anything like this before. Faye sat down and thought, it seems she seriously wants to become a court magician. She asked, was it fire magic? Suddenly, she concentrated several magic elements around herself, closed her eyes and said, attack magic. She freely uses not only fire, but also water and wind. Activation. Then she stretched out her hands and directed magic at the doll, cast a strengthening charm. The protagonist looked surprised and said, even auxiliary magic? Then she closed her eyes, raised her hands and concentrated. The protagonist watched her and thought, this control and variety, they are at the level of a high magician. Meanwhile, she held a fireball in her hands, screamed, she still needs more practice. He clapped his hands and screamed, unbelievable. She turned to him and told him not to talk to her. He continued, if these dolls are so worn out, it means she only trained on them. She clearly lacks combat experience. Then he told her to come over. As her mentor, he would train her in a real fight. She asked, could he, a fraud, handle it? Other mentors would have fled by now. He closed his eyes, raised his hand to his chin and shouted, enough. He himself would show her what it meant to be a real court mage. She stretched out her hand and answered, let's see. She used up all her magic, so in order not to kill him, they would fight hand to hand. He asked in surprise, hand to hand? She continued, and mages are not supposed to know martial arts? The protagonist answered that of course they should. Then he turned and asked, Faye, will she practice hand-to-hand combat? She lay on the ground, waved her hand and said, if she did that, she might accidentally kill her and ruin everything. And the food here was pretty good. Then she added, she hoped he wouldn't lose to this girl. Got it? He smirked and replied, okay. Shield looked at her and thought he could keep up with her speed, and at that moment he got kicked in the neck, but the barrier worked and she fell. She held her leg with her hand and screamed. MC looked and thought, he always holds a barrier that covers his entire body. At that moment she screamed that he is strong. Then she got up and swung to punch, screamed again. He raised his arms, crossed them in front of him, and thought she wants to punch him right in the face? A fake punch? No way. The protagonist jumped back. She looked at him, then crouched and turned away. He smiled and said, no matter where she hits, the result will be the same. She held her wrist with her hand and asked, does he only eat iron every day? He smiled and asked, does that mean he won? Huh? If she can't beat him, they can't fire him. She turned around and said, okay, she'll let him stay a little longer, since he's so hardy, her spell won't kill him. He happily ran to her and shouted, yes, Faye, they can stay longer. They have a place to live and food. Then he pointed his finger back and shouted, Amelia, he'll continue to be her mentor. She told him to shut up, imposter. She'll get rid of him soon. They just have to wait. She left, and he happily said, they can eat their fill tonight too, and Faye agreed. After a while, the maid shouted, Amelia is sick, Shield-san. The protagonist walked ahead and shouted, he won't believe it until he sees it. This is also part of the lessons. He walked to the door, opened it and shouted, hey Amelia. She was lying on the bed with her eyes closed, her arms folded across her chest. He came closer, felt her forehead and shouted, she has a high fever. The maid asked, internal bleeding? Something broken? The protagonist replied that he would try to heal her, okay? The maid wanted to object, said, but he did not let her finish and said to leave it to him. He is the court magician of Helena. Then Faye entered the room and asked, does he need help? He turned around, did not agree and added that she should leave it to him. He is a mentor. The protagonist raised his hand and used magic power. He can also use healing magic. Later, they knocked on the door. Amelia recovered from her wounds. She told him to let her look at his face. He smiled, leaned over and exclaimed, he is glad that she has recovered well. She turned and noticed, she heard, he healed her, extended her hand and added, to heal so effectively, he is clearly not just a swindler. He is not sincere. She finds it hard to believe that he is a court magician. Well, perhaps, but that is why she decided to give him another chance. This time they would test their strength in his so-called magic. Then she shouted for them to go right now. He replied that he hadn't eaten yet. After they went out into the yard, she folded her hands and said, the rule is simple. The fight continues until one of them gives up. Everything else is allowed. He replied, great, a good chance. He will make her understand everything he knows by personal experience. Amelia tossed an arrow in her hand and said, he will not regret even if he dies. He smiled and replied, a simple fire arrow, right? So she underestimates him too. At that moment, she used magic and hundreds of arrows flew towards him. She looked at him and asked, will he withstand these continuous attacks? He thought, oh, it didn't even take 3 seconds to activate them? Okay, he will be a little more serious, but he will not harm her. Then he extended his hand forward and said, barrier magic, absorption, and the arrows began to disappear into the barrier. She got angry and screamed, what? What kind of magic is this? If so, then... She extended her hand and also began to use magic in response. Drops of power swirled around her hand. She screamed for him to receive. He held back the attack and said, it will be very dangerous if it hits the target. Barrier, magic absorption. Then he looked at her and thanked her for the treat. The protagonist asked, what will she do now, Amelia? Suddenly, rain poured down from above. He looked up and asked, rain? Then he folded his arms and asked, what is this? Just an obstacle. He is cold. She said, ice magic. At that moment, his legs began to turn into fragments. He screamed, it can't be. She raised her hands and said, ice gust. Then she smiled maliciously and asked, why doesn't he give up? He threw his arms out to the sides, laughed, and shouted, she's amazing, Amelia. She's really a genius. She's so creative. But afterwards, he folded his arms over his chest, apologized, and added, his barrier is very versatile, you know? She screamed in surprise, that's not fair. He asked what her next move would be. She walked up to the magical doll, lowered her head, and he raised his hands and said, he almost went crazy a while ago. She got angry and screamed, what kind of magic does he use? And asked him to tell her. He raised his hand to his chin and replied, he will tell if she calls him sensei. She tried to say, sen, then screamed, sensei. The protagonist spread his arms out and asked what kind of magic that was. Let her tell him again. Amelia replied that she would kill him if he got proud. He raised his hand to the back of his head and apologized, then added, the only magic he knows is barrier magic. She asked, what? Just basic barrier magic? He added, although he can only use barrier magic, it was because of this that he became a court mage. She looked at him with shining eyes and thought that she couldn't believe it. Shield Reyes, is he really that legendary shield? This is impossible. How could the legendary Great Shield be in such a place? This has to be a joke. What country would expel its national hero, a living legend? He said, but it's true. She was very surprised by his answer and asked him to wait, then asked, is he really that Great Shield? He raised his hand to his neck, agreed, and added that it was him. She turned around and ran to the side. He exclaimed in surprise, what? What kind of reaction is this? After a while, they were sitting in the dining room. Amelia peeked through the open door. At this time, Faye was eating and asked, can he see? He replied, it's scary, so he just ignores it. Amelia asked, so he really is that Great Shield? He agreed, adding that he had already told her from the beginning. She walked up to the table and said, Great Shield. Why didn't he tell her right away? She was acting so rude. That wasn't her real personality. She was so sorry. MC laughed and replied, obviously her previous behavior was real, and this was fake. She ran around the house waving her arms and screaming. The Great Shield was her mentor, and she was acting so rude. She had admired the Great Shield for so long. He was her idol, the most respected court mage in the kingdom of Helena. And yet she acted like that. Then he grabbed her dress and said, it's okay, so they should just go eat. She covered her eyes with her hands and replied, okay. She kept glancing at him and thinking, how awkward. Then she asked, what is the relationship between Lady Faye and the Great Shield? Then she saw the horns and said, oh, she is a dragon. He said that he repelled all her attacks, and in the end she just started following him. Amelia laughed and asked, a dragon? Huh? At that moment she thought, wait, a dragon? Faye turned to her, extended her hand and introduced herself. Her name is Bahamut. Nice to meet you. Amelia replied, well, if the Great Shield says so, then it must be true. She just remembered something that she had forgotten a long time ago. He asked what it was. They still haven't chosen the next leader of the Dragon Forest. If they don't, the dragons might attack the city. How could they forget something like that? The protagonist stood up, put his hands on the table, and said, okay, since it's because of him that they came here, they have no choice but to deal with it. She agreed and added, Amelia will handle it. They need to decide who will be the leader before they go on their journey. Then she screamed at her to stop. She can't interfere with dragon affairs. They turned around and asked in one voice, why? Amelia answered, because dragons are creatures of extreme power. If she does something wrong, it could lead to a war like the one that happened 300 years ago and engulfed the entire world. They answered in one voice again, that everything will be fine. Then they walked forward. He raised his hand and shouted, forward. Today's training is a fight with a dragon. She ran after them and asked them not to do anything reckless. Suddenly, a dragon appeared in front of them. Amelia raised her head up and shouted in surprise. They were just at the entrance of the forest, and they already met a dragon? The protagonist turned to Faye and asked, hey, do dragons even like such meetings? She answered, of course not. They met eyes, and Amelia said, Nidhet, the black dragon, he will inherit the leadership. She came to order him not to harm people, otherwise a war will start if he does not stop. At this point, Faye became Bahamut again and prepared to attack. They watched what was happening, and Amelia asked if they should definitely leave it to Faye. The protagonist picked her up and said actually, he would prefer Amelia to fight. She started screaming that it was impossible. It was far beyond human capabilities. He replied that to become a court magician, you need to be able to do at least that. She asked, is he serious? The protagonist agreed. Meanwhile, the dragons were circling and attacking each other. The protagonist watched the fight, then went up to Amelia, took her hands, their eyes met, and she asked, a great shield? The protagonist stretched his arms forward, closed his eyes and said, activate barrier magic. She stood behind and asked in surprise, a great shield? This is a miracle? Shield asked again, a miracle? Well, protecting the city is a common thing for him. Meanwhile, the dragons were circling above the city and attacking each other. MC raised his head and told her to think about how to fight such creatures later. She screamed, it's impossible. Then she asked how she could even damage him. The great shield? He replied that he defeated Faye with his barrier, but she stared at him and asked in surprise, defeated, did he win? Then Bahamut attacked again in midair. A wave of energy was released from her mouth onto the enemy. He watched her transformation and thought, she really is a real problem. At this time, Faye landed on the ground and approached them. The protagonist asked, she didn't kill him, did she? She disagreed and added, this should be enough for him to obey her order. Amelia stood next to him and screamed, now is definitely not the time for a coffee break. Why is he talking so calmly? Then she raised her hands to her head. Her thoughts were confused in her head. Does he even understand what he just did? He defeated the legendary dragon. Does he think he can just leave like that? He thinks that such things are normal? The legendary Great Shield is here, and with it the ancient dragon Bahamut, and the city is now protected by a miraculous barrier. Is she going crazy? Faye folded her arms and asked, is she broken? He agreed, then turned to her, and he added, besides, if he puts such a huge barrier in the city, he will get involved in politics again. She asked, what? Why? He said, that's how people are. When they gain great power, they try to use it for their own purposes. She shouted, what? Come on, tell them to wait for her. After some time, they were sitting in the dining room, and the count said, oh, he knew he was a court mage, but he never thought that he was the Great Shield who created that very miraculous barrier. Then he dropped his hands to his feet and added, the Great Shield. He is sorry to say this, but he cannot allow them to continue to be a mentor. He was fired, an unexpected dismissal for no reason. The protagonist jumped up, put his hands on the table and asked irritably, let him not say that he was fired from his job as a mentor. The count replied, he is a powerful mage who can change the balance of power on the entire continent. If he stays, it could lead to destabilization of relations with neighboring countries. The protagonist looked at him and asked, is he that serious? He continued, what he was saying doesn't make sense. Why would they expel a person who is single-handedly capable of creating a protective barrier for the entire country? The protagonist continued, even if he asked him, maybe they have some secret plan that makes him no longer needed? The count shouted back, it can't be. Only thanks to this barrier has the kingdom of Helena been able to demonstrate its power to neighboring countries in recent years. It's not an exaggeration to say that this barrier has determined the fate of the entire continent. Then he thought about it and it dawned on him. Doesn't he have a high reputation in other countries? He continued. But in his own country he was not considered a hero at all. He had achieved nothing but barriers. He was just wasting taxpayers' money. His ability to create barriers was taken for granted, and many opposed his appointment as a court mage. The count was indignant. This was absurd. The great nation of Helena was so blind. Then he raised his cup and said thoughtfully, he was currently negotiating with the central government. This was not something he could solve alone. The protagonist covered his face with his hands and screamed, so that meant he was being fired. Despite all his efforts, Faye was sitting next to him and said, it was obvious that he would be involved in politics if he used magic on such a large scale. He exclaimed, if he what? If his darling had defeated Nidhet a little more cleverly, this wouldn't have happened. She screamed back at him not to talk nonsense. If she had let her guard down for even a second, she would have lost. He asked her to wait and asked what she had just said. The count said he had heard that Nidhet and Bahamut had appeared, but were they fighting gods? They asked at the same time. Surprised, gods? He said Lady Faye was actually Bahamut. The count apologized and asked, what? The protagonist told him to look. She couldn't completely hide her golden wings. She had recently repelled Nidhet's attack and protected this city. He asked, surprised, what were you even talking about? Then he took out a book and read, in the country of Urai, where Again is. Dragons are considered gods. It's hard to believe that one is standing right in front of them. Shield turned to her, stretched out his hand and asked, "Really?" She folded her arms across her chest, closed her eyes and agreed. Suddenly, she grabbed her stomach with her hands and screamed. She can't take it anymore. Her stomach hurts. He asked if she was okay. She replied that she couldn't hold it in any longer. He asked her to wait for the country's officials to arrive. By the way, Mr. Shield, if they could offer him a place in this country, would he become their ally? He replied, who knows, then thought, after all, he sees a future where he is used and thrown away again. Is there really no good way to live? If there is a way to live freely? Afterwards, they entered the dining room. Faye was very surprised by the abundance on the table. The protagonist looked at the table and screamed, "Wow." He stretched out his hand and said, could it be that after knowing his true identity, they made the food even more luxurious than yesterday? He definitely won't be able to eat all of this, but it looks delicious. She stared at the food, opened her mouth, and the protagonist said, if it was her, he thought she could handle it. Shield asked in surprise, was it just him, or was there some other meaning hidden in her gaze? Amelia fixed her hair and said, it looks like she wants to mate with him. He screamed, too bluntly. She said it too frankly. At this time, Faye walked up to the protagonist, raised her hand to her head and said, he really knows how to get into trouble. But as expected, he is interesting. He closed his eyes and thought, wow, this is bad. He has a feeling that she has ulterior motives. She folded her arms and thought, I wonder if it is okay to travel with such people. Then she closed her eyes and said, well, if it gets too annoying, she will run away with him. She was daydreaming and added, it would be nice to run away somewhere far away from people and travel. The protagonist remarked, well, it is fun with her now, so it is okay. After some time, they walked through the city. The protagonist turned to her and asked, Amelia, is he going in the right direction? She agreed. He thought it was suspicious. What if he was attacked by an insect? Then they walked on. He turned to her and asked, Amelia, is she sure they are going this way? She agreed. After a while, he fell from a big mountain, got up, lowered his head and asked, does she always say yes? She agreed. Later they were walking through the city. She took his hand and pressed herself against him. He cried and thought, such an attitude, she presses herself against him like glue. The protagonist turned to her and clarified, Amelia, she is too close. She agreed and added, Sensei, she is next to him. Faye looked at her and said, the way she grabs him, she is acting like a cat in heat. If he just does what needs to be done, won't he be free? He screamed at her to stop saying such things. They walked down the street and he thought, he just wanted to walk around the city with two beauties, but for some reason he was not happy at all. He hoped nothing strange would happen again. Suddenly, a girl appeared on the roof of the house in front of them and said, he is exactly as they said. He said in surprise, who is here? She introduced herself. Her name is Murell. She is a swordsman who has earned the title of Holy Sword in the country of beastmen, Irias. She's glad to meet him. He raised his head and asked what he owes her visit to. She began to go down and replied that she received information from intelligence that Shield Rayars was exiled. On the orders of the queen, she hastily came here to receive him as an honored guest. That is the reason why she is here, he said in surprise. An honored guest? She continued. Does he want to go with her to the country of beastmen Irias? Since it was the queen's order, she intended to take him, even if she had to use force. She asked him, still asking politely. He thought about it. He had a bad feeling about it. He didn't care where he went, as long as he had a stable job with good pay. The protagonist apologized and remarked, he didn't let others decide how he lived anymore. That was his answer. She looked at him and said, I see, then raised her hand to take out her sword, apologized, and continued. But when he woke up, he would be in the beastmen country of Irias. The protagonist asked in surprise, what? Then she swung her sword and was about to attack, and he stretched out his hand and shouted, barrier, weapon destruction. She flew back, fell to the ground, started to get up and shouted, what? He looked and thought, usually in such a situation, the weapon should break in two. Murell looked at the sword, smirked and asked, was her sword thrown away? What an interesting barrier magic. But this sword was forged by the best blacksmith in the beastmen country, so it won't be that easy to break then. She jumped up, raised her sword and prepared to attack. And at this time, he raised his hand to his face, and she asked, wow, he can block this too? Then how about this? He looked around and said in surprise, disappeared? Then the protagonist stretched out his arms to the sides and thought, first, he should put a barrier over a large area. He sensed movement, but the attack still hasn't started. When is she going to attack? Suddenly, she flew up and slammed her sword against the barrier and said in surprise, what? It took on a round shape? The protagonist shouted, a barrier, a physical reflection. The sword pushed her away from the collision with the barrier. She fell to the ground, then immediately stood up. He watched her and shouted in surprise, she's still standing? What incredible endurance. She shouted, so this is what he's like, Shield Rayars. Then she raised her hand, looked at her and said, it seems like the power of her own sword turned against her. He said, of course. Then he apologized and added, but her sword won't reach him. She raised the sword, held it in her hands, and he asked, is she really ready to take him dead? She said herself that he is an honored guest. Murell looked at him and answered, if he can't defend himself, then he is not someone their country needs. He laughed and said, it's survival of the strongest. She said that she can continue. She attacks again, and in that second she began to attack. He thought, she is so fast that you can hardly see her, but until she breaks this barrier, she will not defeat him. No matter where she attacks from, it is useless. No attack will get through. At that moment, she swung and shouted, this will be the last blow, and she was thrown back by a wave. The protagonist turned and said, well, that attack was pretty good. She stood there with her clothes torn, raised her hand to her chin and said, but she was completely defeated. She didn't think that even she, with the power of a sword, couldn't reach him. The protagonist immediately turned away and shouted, can she at least cover herself? Everything is visible. She asked. What? He barked. What do you mean what? Why is she so calm? Then he threw her his cloak and said, if she wants, she can wear his clothes. She thanked him, then put on the cloak, lowered her head, closed her eyes, and said, despite the defeat, the queen ordered her to bring him with her. She must at all costs return this barrier magic to their country. She will rest for a few days in this city and look for other ways to recruit him. He smiled and thought, for some reason he was starting to get the feeling that he was doing something bad. Faye suggested that they go get something to eat. Amelia held the protagonist's hand and said, they should go, Mr. Shield. She looked at them, then said, by the way, Mr. Shield, this is a purely personal matter, but... He turned around and asked, what is it? She walked up to him and asked if he wanted to become her husband. The protagonist apologized and asked in surprise, what? Popularity came out of the blue? He thought, husband, then shouted, husband. Marriage? She smiled and said her biggest dream was to marry a man her sword couldn't reach, then asked him to marry her and go to the beastmen country. Areas? He asked loudly. Their relationship is only about them trying to kill each other, right? Amelia shouted, enough already. Master has been hers since the beginning. She is more his type. She raised her hand and asked, does she think so? Her modest chest will not satisfy him. Amelia was burning with anger. Murell said, the battle is decided, then turned to Faye and shouted, hey, does she want to stay by his side too? Faye smirked and said, that's funny. She just wants to eat him. He said, as he thought, she hasn't given up on her idea yet. Her ability allows her to gain the power of those she absorbs. Sooner or later she will eat him and take that wonderful power for herself. He asked, did she make such plans? Murell asked, to eat the man who will become her husband? She replied that she does not interfere with her marriage. The life of humans is too short. He extended his hand and told her not to tell him what. She smiled and remarked, she will eat him when he gets old and senile, and until then they will be friends. Murell extended her hand and said, in that case, Dragon Queen, be a witness to their wedding. Faye extended her hand in response and said, of course. The protagonist said in surprise, why are they shaking hands? Doesn't he have a say? Amelia shouted that she won't give up Master. She shouted that she will bury them all someday, and her breasts will grow bigger. The protagonist was surprised. What about his opinion? Suddenly, they heard a voice asking if they would mind if she contributed to this funny story. She had doubts when she heard that he was banished, but it seems to be true. Nice to meet you, Shield Rayara-san. The protagonist turned around and said in surprise, a spatial movement mage? How rare. She raised her hand to her chest and introduced herself. She is Gabriel Parallel, a representative of Minant. She has come to invite him to Minant. MC thought he had deja vu. He had heard this before. Then he apologized and added, he decided not to go anywhere for a while. She replied that she liked stubborn people, but her mission was to take him with her, and she was very good at it, and in that same second she disappeared. He looked in surprise and shouted, she disappeared? Then he felt a hand on his shoulder and asked, what is this? He turned around and thought, a wall or a reflection? You can't see anything? She raised her hands and said, as expected, everything is not that simple. It seems like something big is brewing. Suddenly, a huge leg appeared in front of the protagonist. He was very surprised. In that same second, a huge monster appeared, on whose shoulder Gabriel sat and said, they will take him by force. At this time, the monster swung a huge club and prepared to attack. She put her hand forward and thought, not damaging the city would be problematic. The protagonist raised his hand, trying to make a barrier, and asked, so she can afford to worry about the city? She waved her finger and said, now that it came down to it, some injuries were inevitable, then wished for him not to die. Meanwhile, the monster swung the club, then clenched his hands into a fist, and slammed them onto the ground. She said, there was no way he could stop it. He raised his hand to his head and yelled, she scared him. Then he turned around, apologized and asked, did she say something? She jumped up and said, if she doesn't do at least this, then asked him to keep her company for a little while longer. He smiled and asked, hasn't he become smaller than he was before? She replied, it's stupid to believe only in what you see. Everything he sees is just the tip of the iceberg. A large black cloud appeared over the city. The protagonist looked up and yelled, hey, this will destroy the city. She looked at him and replied, at this point, some damage is inevitable. He yelled back, it's not some damage. Meanwhile, Murell raised her hand and asked, is she involving them too? Faye said, what a burden. She rose up and screamed. That shows how desperate they were. He shouted, this time he will not hold back. She raised her hands up and shouted to fall. He put up a barrier to prevent the black cloud from falling on the city. She asked. Did she win? He waved his hands and the cloud disappeared. She looked surprised and asked why. She moved away and said, damn. In that case, she will teleport him to Mina with her magic. The protagonist raised his hand and said that he will reflect any magic with his barrier magic. She aimed an attack at him and shouted, spatial magic, forced teleportation. He put his hand in front of himself, creating a barrier and blocking her energy. He said, the barrier is a reflection of magic. Then the energy passed, and he added, it won't work. She was surprised when the clothes on her body also dispersed along with the dispelling magic. The protagonist turned around in confusion. Those present were also surprised by what was happening. Then she covered her naked chest and asked, did he deliberately reflect the magic to transfer only the clothes? He objected. That's not it. She's wrong. That's not it at all. Then he turned around, then handed the shirt to Maria and shouted for her to put it on. She took the shirt in her hand and asked, does he undress her first, then ask her to get dressed? He lowered his head and put his hand to his forehead, apologized and added, it was his mistake, but he asks her to put it on. After that, she got dressed and put her hand to her face, smiled and said that he should take responsibility for this. Murell pointed at her with her hand and said, people of the sea, she's sorry, but she has decided that he will become her husband. She came closer to her and asked, isn't it obvious that he doesn't like aggressive women? She was surprised, huh? Then Gabriel came even closer, their chests touched. She said that she was better suited for night entertainment. Murell was indignant. She also had confidence in night affairs. Then they turned to the protagonist and Murell asked who he would choose. Shield? Gabriel added, ooh. He looked at them confusedly and then shouted, they. Until now, they had all been trying to take his powers, hadn't they? Then he apologized and added, but now he can't look at them like that. Murell said, it seems there is no choice. She will have to take him and seduce him over time. Gabriel said that she will do the same. Amelia clenched her fists and said, but the master belongs to her. The protagonist shouted indignantly, they are not listening to him at all. Then Faye folded her arms across her chest and said, they are all alike. The Margrave will soon bring high-ranking members of the country. It is better to discuss everything there as representatives of their states. Gabrielle folded her arms and looked at Murell and said she agreed. What would she say? A stinking beast woman. She replied that she agreed. A lecherous woman. Faye added that one day she would still eat him. The protagonist smiled awkwardly and said, hey, but he. Before he could finish speaking, he asked in surprise, what? Faye told him to look at the forest. He turned around in surprise and said, no way. Right before their eyes, all the barriers were destroyed by a powerful explosion. She said, the barrier that prevented their dragon race from passing for 3 years. The protagonist noticed that it happened faster than he expected. He put his hands on his waist and told them to look. The barrier that served as the basis for Helen's arrogant kingdom was disappearing. Cheers were heard. A new era had begun. The protagonist thought, it has lasted so long. One of the girls said, the hegemony will depend on where S.H.I.E.L.D. ends up. Now it will be interesting. He thought that it was destroyed in an instant, but it was no longer his business. After a while, Albert put his hands on the table and said, so, he would like to start a meeting to discuss the future of Helen's former court mage, S.H.I.E.L.D. retires. The protagonist looked out the window and thought, it's time to think about the future, right? Albert put his hand to his chin and said, first of all, he presents the conditions of their country, Marai. He spread his hands to the side and added, they guarantee a lifetime position as a court mage. The annual salary will be 10 times higher than that of court mages in other countries. In addition, for food, he will grant the title of Count and Land. The protagonist said that this is incredible. He will live in the country of Marai. The girls looked at him, and then Murell asked if she could continue. She unrolled the scroll and added, Arias offers the title of Duke and the corresponding land. The size of this is 0.1 of the country. The protagonist was surprised. What? This is almost the level of the king of a small country. He will live in Arias. After that, Gabrielle stood up from her seat and said, now it's her turn. They should finally let her present Minat's conditions. She put on her glasses and said, their country is offering S.H.I.E.L.D. the title of Duke, the lands, and even the sea. Developing the territory thanks to his talent will be quite interesting, right? He blushed in embarrassment and said he definitely needs to go to Minat. Then Gabrielle put the documents on the table and added, moreover, if they cede S.H.I.E.L.D. to them, they will hand over the territories of their country Urai and Arias. Albert was surprised. Is she serious? Murell was confused. What? She looked at Albert and he said, 1 vote for Minat. She looked at S.H.I.E.L.D. and asked, what about Minat? Then he raised his hands and shouted, these idiots! After a while, the kingdom of Helena. The king was indignant. Why was their eternal barrier destroyed? The captain of the Knights of Karasari's Vian knelt before him and said, your Majesty, he has arrived. The king shouted, Karasaris, where is S.H.I.E.L.D.? Why hasn't he shown up yet, even though it's been half a day since the barrier was destroyed? He agreed. Apparently he's been missing for about 3 weeks now, and the search is going hard. In order to reduce the burden on his subordinates, could he take charge of the entire search for S.H.I.E.L.D.? The king agreed. Fine. In such a crisis, only someone like him could willingly take on such responsibility. He said he appreciated it. If anything happened, he would personally report to his Majesty. The king asked thoughtfully, but why did Elaine hide this from him? Why was she so calm when her future husband had disappeared? He said he would handle this matter as well. He should leave everything to him. The king added that he was counting on him. He already wanted to rest. He was free. He agreed with him. After a while, he slammed his fist on the scroll and shouted, Damn it, Elaine. Why did she come up with such a stupid plan? She folded her arms and said, It's too late. Who would have thought that the absolute barrier would collapse? She folded her arms and looked at him and added, Besides, it was necessary so that she could marry the crown prince. He was an accomplice too, so he shouldn't try to shirk responsibility. He was outraged at her. He shouted. It was because she promised to appoint him as prime minister for life if she became queen. She was outraged. He was going to put all the blame on her. She then covered her face with her hands and started crying, after which she said that she just wanted to be with her lover. Karasaris looked away and said, Damn, they will hide the truth at any cost. They will shut up everyone who witnessed the broken engagement with money. She said that she understood. He said that he was in charge of finding that person. Once he caught him, he wouldn't stand on ceremony. If it took torture, he would force him to restore the barrier. As long as they had the barrier, they were safe. She then walked to the door and said that she would leave it to him. He agreed with her, and then clenched his fist and said, Now it's his turn. After a while, the protagonist smiled, put his hands on his chest, and said that although Menant's offer pleased him, he was not going anywhere. He would find a high-paying job without unnecessary obligations. Gabriel put her hand to her face and said that she did not think such a thing existed. Rather, he risked being on the run if the countries hunting for the barrier's power began to pursue him. He said that was true. It seemed that there were no more easy solutions left for him in this world. She then put her hand on the documents and asked, Even so, then why don't they do this? She would hand it over to him. The lands of Marai, which is east of Minot. He said that he had already refused. She objected and explained that she didn't mean that, please. He should make Marai an autonomous territory under his rule. Shield. He was surprised. An autonomous territory? It was almost like becoming a king. She said yes. Essentially, it would be independence from their country. In exchange for that, could he set up a barrier in the cities located near the dragon forest? Murell said, protection from the threat of dragons would benefit all countries. Albert smiled and said, in that case, other countries would be able to feel safe. His power is too great to belong to one country. Just a barrier in those cities would greatly increase the defense level of the country. Murell said, it seems like she not only has great breasts, but also a great head on her shoulders. Gabriel thanked her shyly, a beautiful swordswoman. The protagonist then said, that sounds good. He heard that Marai is a land blessed with rich resources. After that, Albert took out a pen and said that in that case, they would move forward with this plan. After that, he opened a bottle of drink and suggested that they celebrate. After that, they clinked glasses of champagne, and the protagonist thought for today's decision. According to the agreement, the first thing to do was to go to Irias, the country of the beastmen in the north. And finally, he set up a barrier in the northernmost city of Minat. He pulled himself up and shouted, done. Faye walked up to him, folding her arms over her chest, and asked, shouldn't it have taken more than one day? He made a sign for her to be quiet and said that he could finish it in an hour. But that would leave a bad impression, right? After a while, Gabriel thanked him and said that she was impressed. And he asked, by the way, if he could move around Minot freely. He wanted to look around anyway before he got to his domain. Gabriel said that she would give him a pass to cross the border checkpoints. Then she handed him the bracelets and told him to take this too. He asked what it was. She explained, a bracelet made of ruby magic stone, certifying him as the lord of the territory. He took the bracelet in his hand and happily thanked her. She said that it would be better for him to show his gratitude by signing the marriage contract. Amelia held his hand and suggested to Shield that he stay here and live as her husband, okay? Murell said, even if he becomes the lord of the territory, the question of whether he will become her husband remains unresolved. Then the protagonist quickly ran forward and said, well, lady, they are leaving. They shouted for him to wait. After a while, Faye, who was walking behind him, asked how much money Gabriel gave them for the trip when they left. He answered that he thought it was about 10,000 gold coins. She asked how much that is worth in the human world. He opened his wallet and said that it was enough for a 10-day journey without any problems. She asked then why they were already out of money after only 3 days. He shouted in surprise, what? Who did she think was the one who ate for 10? If this continued, they would die of hunger before they even reached their lands. She extended her hand to him and told him to start working. He was indignant, and she was not going to work? She wondered, why would she do that? She spread her arms out to the sides and added with a smile, she had no reason to work, right? If he died of hunger, she would just eat him. He clenched his fists and said, then if he wanted to earn a stable income without revealing his identity, there was only one place that came to mind. She told him not to do anything illegal. He said, not like that. After a while, he entered the Adventurers Guild. He was told, welcome. Faye folded her arms and said, I see. Adventurers Guild, right? They walked forward and she said that everyone here looked weak. He turned around and told her to be quiet. After that, they approached the employee and the protagonist asked if they had a quest. He wanted to register as an adventurer and take a quest. She sighed, then turned around and said, I see. The protagonist shouted indignantly. She just thought he looked weak, right? She filled out the paperwork and replied that was not the case at all. Does he have experience working as an adventurer there? He said no. And she asked if anyone could vouch for his abilities. He again replied no. She smiled and said that then he was an E-rank adventurer. She congratulated him. After that, she handed him a flyer and said, "Great. Here's a list of quests available to him." The protagonist asked if there was a quest to hunt strong monsters. She continued to smile, then reminded him that he was an E rank. He was indignant. He would not make money from this. She reminded him of his rank again. He clenched his fists, trembled with anger, and then said, "But he has a companion who eats for 10. After that, Isis came up to them and asked, "What's the noise? Do you need help?" The worker looked at him with loving eyes. The protagonist turned around and asked, "Who is he?" The worker said it was Isis. "This adventurer wants to take on more difficult tasks." The protagonist clenched his fists and shouted that he can handle it at his own risk. She agreed with him, and then Isis smiled and said that in that case, he will show him the world of high-level adventurers. He should follow him. The worker said, "The best B-rank adventurer in this city is Isis-san," and went to help the newbie himself. He raised his index finger and said, "It's okay. This is also a useful investment." The protagonist looked at him and said, "Tall, handsome guy." She folded her hands and noted that it was not exactly an insult. Then he asked if he would split the reward. Would he agree? The protagonist blushed in embarrassment and said that this was very generous. He thought, "You fool, there are only 2 of them." After that, Isis suggested taking a quest for the Ginga turtle. He was surprised. The Ginga turtle? After some time, they were in a cave. Isis walked ahead, stopped. He spread his arms to the sides and said that he should be careful. This dungeon is full of weak monsters. The Ginga turtle is an A-rank monster. Its shell has high resistance to both physical and magical attacks. The Ginga turtle is hiding in its shell when it feels threatened, so it will be difficult to deal with. The protagonist folded his arms across his chest and followed him, thinking how to defeat the Ginga turtle. If it hides in its shell, his barrier magic will not work. What? He must attack. Why did they take a quest against monsters that hide? Then Isis turned around and gave him a thumbs up and noticed that he looked pale and asked if he was going to retreat. The protagonist asked in surprise, "What?" Then he came closer and squeezed his hand and asked, "Who said he was afraid? This will be easy." Isis put his hand on his head and then let go and said, "By the way, he doesn't see any monsters here." He replied, "Well, that's to be expected." He asked, "What does he mean?" He replied, "It doesn't matter." Then the knight smiled and asked, "By the way, which of the 2 of them is in the vanguard and which is in the rear guard?" The protagonist said he doesn't need it, right? He was surprised. What? He grabbed his head and said, he can't believe how experienced they are. It's better to assign roles. It's easier to adapt to different monsters in battle. But now he doesn't have to worry about that. He's here. So he should just focus on safety. Today, he better just needs to defend himself. He should hide behind him and not do anything reckless. The protagonist thought, is he serious? Maybe he really is a good guy. Then the knight said, "Hey, there she is." Right in front of him, a huge mouth with sharp teeth opened. A huge turtle daughter. Isis took out his sword and shouted to leave her to him. Then he pushed off the ground and jumped to attack. The main character extended his hand to him and shouted for him to wait. If he attacks recklessly, a monster. The knight pointed the sword at the turtle's head and shouted, "He will finish it off with one blow before it hides in the shell." The next second, the head was lost in the shell. He began to fall down and shouted, "Wow, not even a scratch was left." Then he climbed up on the shell and said, "This is not fair. She has to come out." The protagonist thought, he can't use the barrier in this situation. The knight continued to attack the spiky shell. The protagonist thought that his attack had lured the Ginga turtle out, but if this continued, his sword would break before they could pierce it for him to take it. He then cast a reinforcement barrier on the knight's weapons. In response, after that, he turned around and told them not to come any closer. The protagonist shouted, "No, even if they wanted to, they couldn't do anything." The protagonist raised his hand and thought, these weak attacks are of no use to it. Maybe if he strengthened his sword with a barrier, its tip would become more powerful. After Isis finally plunged the tip of his sword into the shell and was surprised, it seemed to have become a little stronger. Then he shouted, "Yes! He's on target. He'll cut the shell in half." He then delivered a cross attack and shouted in surprise, "What is this?" The turtle suddenly began to spin quickly, and he shouted, "It's rushing straight at them at full speed." The protagonist thought he should put a barrier on Isis before it's too late. The knight closed his eyes, trembled with fear, and tried to cover him with his sword. The protagonist called out loudly to him, but he answered to the side. The protagonist looked at him and thought, damn, he was too fast. He didn't have time to completely cover him with a barrier. Thank God he's still alive. He thought that he attacked the Ginga turtle, but what should they do now? After a while, Isis, leaning on his sword, asked, "What was that?" He could barely block it. He shouted, "The rank of this monster is clearly incorrect. It's not rank A, it's S." Then the turtle went on the attack again, and the protagonist thought that Isis is already at his limit. He should at least step back. Then the knight turned around and shouted, "Fool." He told him to hide. Then he looked forward in surprise and thought, he's even faster than before. The protagonist saw a monster approaching him with its mouth open and thought, too fast. If only he could make it in time. The knight extended his hand forward, but then a stream of blood flew right next to his hand. He was surprised. Maybe he was dead? Had the invincible barrier fallen? Isis asked, "Is that the head of a Ginga turtle?" If even after reading the plan he did not understand it, then it was time to get down to business. The protagonist stretched his shoulder and noticed that he was an incredibly problematic guy. The knight shouted in surprise, "What did he do?" He replied that he put up a barrier. He shouted in surprise, "Did he seriously stop the attack of the Ginga turtle with such primitive magic?" The protagonist confirmed it. And so it happened. Faye climbed onto the turtle's body and said that she was going to try a piece of its shell. The protagonist shouted for her to wait. Is she really going to eat it? Is she even capable of chewing it? And she bit off a small piece. Isa shouted, unbelievable. She actually ate it. The protagonist said that he could sell it profitably. Then Faye said, not bad. The knight shouted in surprise, what is this? In place of her wings, a whole shell suddenly appeared, and she said, yes, it is enough to fill it with magic, and it becomes incredibly hard. It is interesting. The protagonist noted that it looks, of course, a little ridiculous. It is better to hide it. She asked, does he think? Okay, she will take it out only when necessary. Then her wings returned to their place, and the protagonist turned around and said that he will take the rest and sell it. After that, he called Isis. He was lying on the ground. Faye, noticing this, noticed that he lost consciousness. The protagonist said, the problem only multiplies. After that, he looked at the bag full of money and said, but now they will be able to travel peacefully for some time. The knight, looking at him, thought that he could not believe it. This man is the same legendary shield. The protagonist asked if he could really keep all of this for himself. He replied that he had done almost nothing. After all, he had done all the work. He called him and said why he didn't go with them to Marai. They could use a man like him. He replied that he hardly could. He was the best adventurer in that city. The protagonist said that he understood him. He felt sorry for him. Well, maybe they would meet again there. In response, he wished him luck. Faye came back, turned around and said, remained a good person until the very end. The protagonist agreed, and in gratitude, he left him a small gift. After some time, Faye said, they finally arrived. They got to the city literally on the verge of starvation. Did he punch a hole in his pocket? The money disappears too quickly. He said it was because she was the one who was constantly dragging them to expensive places. She looked away and said, but even so, the city was somehow empty. He shouted indignantly for her to stay on topic. After that, the man opened the door of the building next to him. He shouted in surprise, a priest? The protagonist looked at him in surprise. The other two men grabbed their heads and said, mistake. He can't wait any longer for the priest to arrive. It's annoying. The protagonist said that he wasn't a priest, but he could help. He thought if they dealt with this, maybe they would be given something to eat. After a while, he was surprised. A curse. He replied that it was true. He added that people in the city were getting sick. Shield remarked, that's why they were waiting for the priest. Since he wasn't here, he would deal with it himself. Faye, who was sitting at the table next to him, said that the curse didn't stop the barriers. The protagonist shouted, there was no other way. If this goes on and they don't get food, he'll starve to death soon. She folded her arms and smiled and said that it was fine with her. As soon as he kicks the bucket, she'll eat him. He shouted in surprise. What? The townspeople were surprised. Can they even trust these people with such a serious matter? Then the protagonist shook the man's hand. He asked him to help them. After a while, they came to the forest. Faye said they are leaving the city with such zeal, but without a clear plan. They don't even know if this is really a curse. The protagonist turned around and asked, does she know anything about this? She replied that she has no idea. The curse is too weak. Even a human can't kill it. Although there is a familiar smell in this place. Familiar? She walked forward and said that she can't remember. He noted that she still recognized the smell, despite so many years having passed. After that, she said that they had arrived. The protagonist covered his mouth with his hand and said that he also felt a powerful magical energy. Then he shouted, no, the lake has turned red. She said, so this is where it is. The protagonist looked at her and wondered, what was she talking about? He then looked into the water and shouted in fear, a demon. She explained that it was Azazel, the demon who was her right hand in the war between gods and humans. He was surprised. Her right hand? He must be incredibly strong. She then extended her hand forward and said, remove the seal. He was surprised. She must wait. What was she going to do? The chains began to fall off the demon, and she smiled and said that she had figured out the nature of the curse. It seemed that this guy's magic had slipped through the crack in the seal and infected the people of the city. The protagonist said in fear, this is even worse than their original mission. He then jumped out of the water and landed on one knee, raising his hand to his chest, and then said, Lady Faye, he has not seen her for 300 years. She smiled, looked at him, and noticed that he was still as formal as before. He closed his eyes and apologized. These pathetic humans sealed him. I am willing to accept any punishment. She put her hand on his head and said, there is no need for punishment. He replied that he appreciates her kindness, but after that, he opened his eyes full of rage and asked, why is there a human next to her? The protagonist looked at him in surprise. Then Azazel walked towards him and told her to let him kill this insignificant mortal. He shouted in surprise. What? Faye turned around and said that the war with humans ended long ago, and they lost it. He said then we need to start a new one. As a first step, he will take his head to declare war. He concentrated energy in his hand and said that he has become even stronger than before. She was surprised this. He continued for her, the magic of corruption. Over 300 years of imprisonment, he developed this spell, and it is not the first time he has used it. He believes that even the hero of humanity cannot stand against it. She said, amazing. Humans won't be able to analyze it or find an antidote. He said if that hero appeared again, he would kill him for her sake, and she, Lady Faye, would be able to rule over humans. The protagonist thought in surprise, hero? He was talking about that same war between gods and humans that happened 300 years ago? Faye thought for a moment, and then closed her eyes and said, "She can't allow this. There are creatures in this world now that are much more terrible than heroes." Azazel asked, "Even with his corruption magic and its power, they won't be able to defeat them?" She replied that she didn't think so. "He wanted to test it?" he asked. "Where could they find such a powerful opponent?" She replied, "Over there." With that, she pointed her fingers at the protagonist. He shouted in surprise, "Him?" Azazel asked, "That guy?" She said if he could kill him, maybe they would reconsider the war with humans. He flexed his hand and asked, "So he just needed to kill him?" She agreed and added, "If he can." The protagonist shouted, "She must wait, little one." The next second, Azazel sent corruption magic at him, creating an explosion in front of them. Faye, watching this, smiled and said, "Everything around is flying apart." After that, Azazel turned to her and said that it was easy. She folded her arms over her chest and told him not to be arrogant. He was surprised. Why? At that moment, the protagonist was expelled from the hole in the ground and said, "How scary." Azazel looked at his hand and asked, "Has he not yet regained all his strength?" In that case, he would attack directly. The next second, he sent several huge rocks at the protagonist, pinning him to the ground. After that, she shook her hands and said, "Now he is definitely finished. Why would they start an invasion?" Then he was surprised, saw the protagonist coughing, and said to at least give him a break. Azazel explained, "It seems he will have to fight him face to face." Honestly, he did not want to touch humans. They are so dirty. Then the protagonist asked in surprise, "Did he disappear?" He turned around and thought, "Where is he? He has never encountered corruption magic. He has no idea how to resist it. He does not even feel its presence," as if he became a ghost. The next second, the demon was very close to him and smiled and said, "He caught him. Sayonara." His eyes reflected the face of the demon. The protagonist thought, "Will he die? Is there really no way to deal with such a crushing force?" After some time, the kingdom of Helena, a voice was heard in the castle. "He must retreat." The subordinate agreed with him. "Yes, sir." The king then raised his hand to his head and said, "The captain of the knightly order will take care of everything." He then asked, "Why is she, the royal monk, here?" Olivier Arcana. Hey, he doesn't remember granting her an audience. Why is she silent? She walked up the stairs leading to him and asked why. Instead of investigating the reason for Shield's disappearance, he was just forcibly trying to find him. If he was found, then the reason would be clear. He replied, "So she wasn't even going to investigate?" She confirmed, "That's right." He raised his hands and shouted that he was already tired. She should leave. She couldn't hear him. She came closer, placed her hand on the throne next to his face, said, even with her high praise as a court mage, Shield had a unique talent. He asked, "What was she talking about?" She replied, "He himself didn't say anything." So she too remained silent for these 3 years, but she believed that the work he did was not appreciated fairly. He asked, was she blaming him for this? She lowered her hand and then turned around and said, "If that's how he heard it, then that's how it is." He shouted, "You impudent girl." She said that when his engagement was announced, she hid her feelings and cried at night, and she never wanted to go through that again. She was not going to lie to herself anymore. He asked in surprise, what was she even talking about? She threw down her pocket watch and said that she was not going to go down with this sinking ship. Today, she would resign as a court magician and go in search of Shield. The king shouted in surprise, "What?" She even knew where he was. She said that once she started looking, she quickly got to the bottom of the truth. Then she wondered if maybe he should also find out how stupid his subordinates had done to her. He said, then they said goodbye. The truth? What did that mean? After some time, she walked down the street and turning to a resident, asked if she could detain him for a minute. She unrolled the scroll in front of him and said, Shield Rayars was supposed to come to this city. He said, it seems he heard his name somewhere. Then Amelia ran up to them and shouted in surprise, did she just say Shield? Albert followed her, shouted for her to stop. Olivier showed her the scroll and said, it looks like this handsome man, but Albert, smiling awkwardly, noticed that it was not exactly him. Amelia shouted, oh yes, he is the spitting image. Who drew this? It's a masterpiece. Olivier asked, is it true? She smiled and looked away and answered, but if it was about Shield, then most likely he went north. She said that she understood. Amelia looked at her in surprise and said that she could at least listen to the end. Olivier bowed and said, meanwhile, Olivier will follow her future husband. She ran in the opposite direction and shouted, oh, she said that out loud? Amelia shouted after her. What? She clenched her fists and added, she disappeared. Who is this girl? Teleportation. So she is very strong. After that, Olivier continued searching, showing the drawing to more and more people. After some time, Aazel stood in front of a huge monster and said, it seems that A-rank monsters are not yet his strength. Even the life saved by Shield, it seems, will end now. The next second, he put a shield in front of himself, defending himself from the blow, but then Olivier easily attacked the monster, flew forward. He looked at her and thanked her. She grabbed his clothes and asked, did he just say Shield? He awkwardly confirmed it. Then she showed him the drawing and shouted, is he talking about this person? He answered, a little different from how he looks in real life, but probably yes. She shouted, where is he now? He answered, he went to the residence of Lord Marai. She knelt down and shouted, again. He asked, is she okay? Tears were streaming down her face. She shouted that she had already been to Aegon and to Irias and to Menant, all to no avail. He smiled and offered to eat first. He was treating. She said that she understood. Then they walked forward, and he asked, what does she want? She answered, Shield. He answered that he meant food. But Olivier still had a long way to go to find S.H.I.E.L.D. Her solo journey was still ongoing. Meanwhile, Azazel grabbed the protagonist by the clothes, but he used a barrier, a reflection of magic. The demon showed his teeth and was surprised. What? Then the barrier seemed to cut off his arm. He jumped back and said in surprise, "This seems like a normal barrier spell. But why is it so powerful?" Faye smiled and asked, "Didn't she tell him? His barrier is terrifyingly strong. It can reflect any magic." The demon took a stance and said, "In that case." The protagonist waved his hand and said that analyzing won't change the situation. But at that moment, Azazel was behind him and thought that he would destroy him before he could realize anything. He used decoy magic. He then pointed his hand forward at the protagonist's barrier. In response, he showed that he had better take care of himself. He should look. He lost his arm. Azazel said, "That's enough." Then he called out to Lady Faye. She shouted in annoyance, "Such a wound will heal in just a week." The protagonist thought in surprise, his arm and wings will recover in a week? Isn't that more impressive than his barrier? Then he bowed and asked, "Did all humans master such magic?" Faye said that as far as she knew, only he did. He said that he understood Lady Faye's intention, so the takeover of humanity would only begin after his death. In 10 years, she smiled and noticed that he was catching on quickly. The protagonist thought that if she absorbed his barrier magic after his death, humanity would be doomed. In 100 years, the world would be unrecognizable. Then she extended her hand forward and, addressing Azazel, told him to go to Marai for 100 years to train and rest. He bowed and said that before going there, he had something to finish. He snapped his fingers. Bats flew past them. The protagonist exclaimed in surprise, "Wow!" At this time, the demon's body began to disappear, as if it was turning into a huge number of bats. He said then. The protagonist shouted in confusion, "He is incredible." Faye noticed that this guy is smart. Bats can be useful to them. The protagonist turned around and shouted in surprise, "Make them allies? But they are so scary." She said that they can become valuable allies. It is not only their fighting power, their true strength lies in their overwhelming influence. They subjugate both allies and enemies through fear, and this is their nature. The protagonist thought, when she said the total number, she means traitors too? He raised his hands to his face and shouted that it was impossible. Then she added, "If they swear an oath of loyalty, they do not betray. Besides, he is confident in his barrier for nutrition, right?" He was slightly confused and then confirmed it. The girl she went further and said, "But then she will go and report and get her reward." He ran after her, shouted for her to wait. "She is walking too fast." After a while, the protagonist asked, "Isn't Marai up ahead?" The protagonist raised his hands and added, "Getting here was a nightmare." He was even suspected of conspiring with Azazel and demanded proof. But in the end, everything worked out well. They were almost there. After that, he shouted, "Yes, it's a real miracle that they got here alive." Then he looked at Faye, who said that she was hungry. They should go faster. He said, "Honestly, she's just..." After that, they stopped on a hill and looked at the city ahead. He said Marai turned out to be much more impressive than he expected. "It's really huge, right?" Later, they entered the city. He asked, "Does all this really belong to him now?" She confirmed. MC pointed to the building in front, said that this was most likely his estate. After that, they came closer, and the protagonist, turning to the guard, said, "Hey, he heard that if you show this, they will let you through." With these words, he showed him the bracelet. The man was surprised. "What is this?" The protagonist smiled and stated, "That's right. He is their new Lord Shield Rayaris." He then looked at Faye and asked, "He looked cool, right?" She replied, "That's not true at all." After that, the guards bowed, and one of them said, "His lord, they have been waiting for him. Please, he should pass." The protagonist looked at her and asked, "Do you think they will send a golden carriage to meet them at the gate?" She held her hands on her chest and replied, "Who knows?" After that, the gate doors in front of them opened. They walked forward in surprise. One of the guards approached a worker and said, "It's the new lord." The subordinate slightly opened the doors and said, "This way, please. Someone is already waiting for him." After that, he turned to the side and said, "He asks to wait here." Faye stopped and said, "It seems like they are not too welcome here." The protagonist thought so. He could feel their cold gazes. She said if they reject them, they will simply eliminate them. He thought, how encouraging. Then she came back and asked, "So who are they waiting for?" At that moment, Von Gauche came out from the open doors. He said, "Welcome, representatives of the Helena kingdom. He learned everything from Lord Gabriel. His name is Von Gauche." The protagonist said, "Representatives of the Helena kingdom." "Yes." He then added, "Since the previous lord entrusted him with the management of this land, he is responsible for it. By the way, they say the new lord comes from the common people." He pointed at him with his cane and added, "It will be better for both sides if he continues to live as before." Faye asked, "Should he inform Gabriel about this?" The protagonist disagreed and added, "He will take back the real power with his own hands." He then asked, "In other words, he is offering him to be a nominal lord while all the real power remains with him?" Van said that he can interpret this as he wishes. He replied, "Okay. This may take a long time." Then as Aazel entered the room, Van screamed in surprise. Then he bowed in front of Faye and said that he released their sealed companions. He asks to let him serve under S.H.I.E.L.D. for about 10 years. After that, he kissed her hand, and she replied, "Okay." Van shouted loudly, "Who dared? What impudence in front of him? Van Gauche!" All the guards shouted forward. Then Azazel pointed his hand forward, releasing dark energy. and said that he will not interfere with him. The man looked at him in fear, and then Wang looked at his frightened subordinate and shouted, "What is he doing?" Then he noticed a wet spot between his subordinate's legs and shouted, "He is pathetic." Beluga then called out to Azazel. She said that she will eliminate the impurities. He looked at her and told her to do so. She then took the sword in her hand, stood in front of one of the frightened subordinates. So he looked at her and asked for mercy. In response, she stepped on his foot and brought the sword to his face and told him to remember, leaving tails later creates problems. Although without a head, he will not remember anything. With these words, she chopped his body. Van shouted, "How dare they? With their entire army, they." Before he could finish speaking, the demon directed his now terrifying energy at him and told him to shut up. Van seemed to disappear into thin air, and the protagonist shouted for them to wait. This will simply turn into ruling through fear. Azazel knelt down in front of him and said, "Demons are sensitive to bloodlust. For those who do not know their place, there is no place here." He noted that this was true, but the demon then turned to Beluga and asked, "What about the rest of the hostile insects in these lands?" She said that she had already dealt with them. After that, she turned to her subordinate and told him to let them in. He agreed. At that moment, several workers held their hands behind their backs and knelt down in front of them, and she said, "Only these 5 previously had enmity towards him." Shield. He got angry and shouted, "What? Only 5? And they had already killed everyone else?" He thought. 2 guards at the gate, 1 cook, a new maid, and a girl. After that, he extended his hand forward and told them to continue working as before, and he would double their wages. However, everything that happened today remains a secret. The workers with tears in their eyes shouted joyfully, as expected of their lord. They are grateful for the food. He laughed and then looked at the girl in surprise and thought, she is staring at him. She does not look like an ordinary maid. He walked closer, leaned towards her and thought, who is this girl? Who is this mysterious stranger hiding in the shadows? Then he looked at her hands and thought, are her hands shaking? One of his subordinates said, it seems she is the hidden heir of the previous lord. Wang kept her imprisoned. The girl told them to untie her. Then she sighed in relief, but Beluga grabbed her clothes. The protagonist asked, hey, what is this wound? Does she have more like this somewhere? She screamed for them to stop and let her go. While she was trying to run, the clothes fell down. Scars became visible. The protagonist was horrified, thought, what happened to this child? Then she screamed for him not to look. Hasn't he humiliated her enough? If she is locked up again and suffers, it is better to just die. Then Beluga asked if he wanted her to take care of her. He replied for her to leave it. It is his fault for not being more sensitive. Tears were flowing from the girl's eyes. The protagonist thought, a life where death seems like salvation. The world was too cruel to this child. Then he put his hand out, shouted, hey, they should immediately bring medicine and take care of her. She asked in surprise. What? He was surprised. Why? Wouldn't anyone do the same in his place? She was surprised. He kills and enslaves people, right? He extended his hand to her and said that he does nothing like that, then asked, will they start from scratch? She extended her hand in response and apologized. Then she put her hand to her chest and added, she should have thanked him first. Her name is Lumiere Marai. She is grateful to him for saving her. The protagonist smiled, looked at her and thought, it seems that aristocrats remain aristocrats. Then she said that she understands that he is not like Van Gogh, but she will not allow demons to take over this land. This is Marai, the city her father dedicated his entire life to. She will protect her loved ones. Just before, she said happily, ready. She concentrated energy in her hands and said, everything is fine now. The old man said, baby? The old man looked at the barrier near the nest with birds and noticed that it was using strange magic. The protagonist was surprised. Strange? He said that he had seen many spells, but his papers did not look like any of them. The protagonist asked, isn't this just barrier magic? He replied that he did not know. At that moment, the snake headed for the nest, crashed into the barriers, and the old man added, but there are only cool attack spells. Why is he so eager to master this particular power? The protagonist wondered. Why? He said that this contains strength, the ability to protect what is incredibly dear to him. Then he said that he understands, which means she also has something to protect. That is, she was surprised. What is he talking about? Then he snapped his fingers and said, okay, he will teach her magic. She needs to become stronger and try to take this city from him. However, he only teaches barrier magic. She screamed in surprise. Barrier magic? This is not enough. Then Beluga covered her mouth and began to lead her away. The protagonist waved his hand and said that he hoped that she would be of use to them. Then Azazel came up to him and asked what he should do now. He bowed and replied, they should wisely manage the legacy left by the previous lord. The protagonist said, in other words, after a while, they went outside and he said, now I understand why the city's development was so slow. If they hadn't built these dams, the city would suffer from devastating floods with every rainstorm. They need to strengthen the water system first. It seems that the flood control work was abandoned due to the huge financial costs. But if we continue like this, it will lead to constant recovery from natural disasters. Well, they were just peasants. He didn't seem to care about their fate. Then a man came up to him and asked, is he a shield? The protagonist clarified, is he the city manager? One of the old men asked, why is the lord cooperating with demons? Beluga added, by the way, that's right, if he comes with so many demons, the people will start to be afraid. The protagonist turned around and asked them to move away, and then apologized and said that he didn't mean to seem arrogant. The man asked, Does he dare to lie so blatantly? And the protagonist put his hands on both sides and said that they didn't come here to fight. They live here to work on strengthening the flood defense. The man was surprised. Are they going to work on the flood defense system? If they do that, they won't be able to collect excessive taxes under this pretext anymore. He shouted, "Hey, they don't believe these lies, right? Even without this so-called flood defense project." The man behind him shouted, "Big brother." At this time, Beluga flew forward, swung her weapon, and cut off the man's head. The man behind her screamed, "She's a scumbag. How dare she touch his brother?" Then the weapon in her hands disappeared. She turned around and said, "Everyone who has something to say should come forward." The protagonist looked at her and thought, no matter how many times he saw it with his own eyes, her strength was truly terrifying. He would never want to fight against such power. After that, he said that she should not even think about ruling through fear. This is not what he strives for. Perhaps it is better to show than just explain. He created a barrier around himself, and she asked, what does he mean by show? Several villagers screamed in surprise as the protagonist continued to expand his barrier. With tears in his eyes, one of the surprised shouted, "This?" The protagonist, continuing to maintain the barrier, smiled and said that this barrier will last for 3 years. The others asked, "This is just a transparent barrier, right? Isn't it too thin?" The woman told him to speak more quietly. "Or he also wants to lose his head." The protagonist laughed and said that it was okay. Why don't they try it? They should experience it. After a while, the host put the microphone to his mouth and asked, "Is everyone ready?" They will begin the tournament to destroy the Lord's barrier. The rules are simple. This barrier was set up by the Lord himself. The one who deals the most damage to it will win. The winner will receive special prizes, a specially made set of equipment, barriers enchanted with magic from the Lord, and also, instead of a regular army, and great benefits. One of the people present said, "They say he only uses barrier magic." The woman said, "They attach so much importance to some barrier magic." She replied that this is not so. This is not just some barrier magic. This is the same one that surrounded the kingdom of Helena. She said, "It is obviously fake." After that, the host raised his hand, shouted, "That's it. Silence. They can attack it as much as they want for 10 minutes. They must get ready. On start. Let's go." Several warriors rushed to attack, and the host shouted, "This is intensity. Even the most famous adventurers of the city are taking part." The next second, there was an explosion. The villagers covered their faces with their hands from it. The woman's daughter clenched her fist as she shouted, "This will be easy." The protagonist chuckled and said that they will see. Then he shouted, "Hey, they must see." He opened the perfect barrier. The villagers were surprised. What? Not a single scratch. The people clapped their hands and shouted, "There is still plenty of time. They must not stop." The host said that there are only 5 seconds left. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, end. After that, he blew his whistle and said that nothing had changed. The barrier is still perfect. It seems that this tournament may not have a winner. Then, his lordship, please, he should announce the verdict. After that, he jumped down to the villagers. The MC raised his hand, stretched it out to the barrier, creating an electric pulse. After that, he said, "Wow, it looks like this attack was the most effective." The host smiled and said, "They will announce the results. Winner number 24. The man raised his hand with a joyful smile and clenched his fist. The main character clapped and said that they congratulated him. Then Beluga approached him and asked, "Her lord, what was the point of a tournament where no one was injured?" He was surprised by this and said that this was how they found out the fighting ability of the villagers. In any case, Beluga would soon start recruiting for the army, so the goal would be achieved. Comrades should help each other, right? With these words, he winked at her, and she, blushing with embarrassment, said, "Comrades." He asked, "What?" She said that she thought he was useless and could not do anything, but she changed her mind. Then there was silence in the air, and the protagonist turned away with tears streaming down his face. He noticed that she had hit the nail on the head. What kind of impression does he give? She answered confusedly. Maybe she was not completely lying when she said that she had thought about it a little. He was surprised. Did she say something? She answered, "Nothing." Then one of the demons flew up to him and shouted, "His lord." He asked, "What happened?" He answered, "There are guests in the mansion." The protagonist was surprised. Guests? Then he asked, "Is it them?" The protagonist asked, "Why did Gabriel come here?" Then he leaned over and said, "Indeed." After that, the protagonist said, "What a hassle." After that, he entered the estate, and the maid bowed and said, "Welcome home, my lord." He walked on. Faye followed him and asked, "Does he already guess who the visitor is?" He said, "They say he is strong, so it is probably Olivier. This is the one who is called the strongest court magician. You need to be prepared." After that, he opened the door and shouted as expected, "It is she, Olivier." But at that moment, he saw a man in the office who said, "Alas, it is he, Mr. Game Mage." The protagonist was surprised. What is he doing here? Faye said that she thought that some nice girl would come, but here is a bald man. He said that he himself would like to know. He thinks that for such a small thing as delivering him, a great court magician, it is not even worth bothering. He just has to deliver a bug like him. The protagonist was surprised. Deliver? He folded his arms and noticed, "Right, this is an order from that same politically skilled knight captain." The protagonist said, "He was taken out, driven out. What is all this about now?" He replied that he has no idea. Personally, even without the barrier in the country of Helena, he doesn't care. But it seems that the higher-ups have a different opinion. They need a barrier. The protagonist thought, if anyone can contradict the knight captain, it will be the king. So the king was not involved in his exile? Then the protagonist raised his hand and said that he does not know the whole background, but he is not going to return. If he tries by force, he will not spare. The game magician was surprised and asked, is he seriously going to fight him? Then he stomped on the floor and said, he can only put up a barrier. He must not die there. The order is to deliver him alive. He thought, that only by a lucky chance he became a court magician? You can't even imagine what the real power of a magician looks like. Then the protagonist covered his eyes with his hand and shouted, light? He can't open his eyes. He thought, what the? Even his wonderful barrier can't protect against such light. It's just light, so it's not an attack. His barrier magic won't work. But barrier magic isn't just a reflection. The next second, he hit the opponent in the neck, shouted for him to catch. Then he presented his hand to the floor and used a barrier magic detection. He felt the opponent and, turning around, thought from this side. After that, the Game Mage hit the wall, destroying it. The protagonist covered it with his hand and then said, finally he sees. The Game Mage hung in the hole in the wall and the protagonist shouted in surprise, what? Faye folded her arms and said, food, faster. He asked, did she do this? She replied, sitting and watching forever is stupid. And she's hungry. He said, I see. Then he thought, for her it was just trash. She's cool. Then he asked, by the way, is he okay? He didn't die, right? The next second, the Game Mage's trembling hand appeared from behind the ramparts and he said, damn. The protagonist noticed, alive. He got angry and told him not to think that this is the end of it. There are still a lot of people wanting to get to him. He is just a cutie compared to them. The protagonist said, damn, it looks like Olivier will show up soon too. Then he walked away, turned away, raised his hand to his chin and thought, if the one called the strongest court mage really comes, his barriers will be tight. At that moment, Faye extended a stick to the defeated opponent and asked, maybe she should eat him already? The protagonist thought, it seems it's time to strengthen the troops. At that moment, Azazel entered the room and said that. The protagonist turned around, called him, and then he went to Faye and handed over the food and said, judging by these traces of the attack, it's the work of Lady Faye, no other way. She took the bag from his hands, told him to give her the food. Then he asked, is this an enemy? The protagonist answered, well, as he sees it. He said that he understood. He will collect this trash. The protagonist added, by the way, Azazel, we should speed up the strengthening of the troops. He kept his hands on his waist and noted that this is true. The selection for the regular army is just ending. He should entrust it to him and go himself. The protagonist asked, the strongest? After some time, Caprice threw her sword over her shoulder and said, he lost. The protagonist watched her and said, it is. The demon next to him said, Milady. The protagonist added, he heard that the selection for the army is taking place. She said that now there is a fight for the post of captain of the night squad. The final duel is just beginning. The protagonist said, if he is not mistaken, this is the same Caprice, the strongest duelist of the demons. Oliver came up to her. She turned around and asked, is he the last one? What is his name? He said his name is Oliver. She laughed and shouted, yes, he is shaking all over. The protagonist watched them, folded his arms across his chest and thought, honestly, he looks very weak. Will he cope at all? Since this is the final, it means that he also got here. The same Oliver. It means that he went through all the stages and reached the final. Then Caprice asked, Shield? When did he manage to arrive? Then she pointed her sword at her opponent, smiled and asked, can she kill him? The protagonist noticed that they were ready. Oliver asked her to be lenient. The protagonist said, take positions, begin. The next second, Caprice crossed her swords in front of her opponent's neck and smiling, hoped that he would not die too quickly. The protagonist thought in surprise, what kind of speed was that? If this continues, they'll lose a valuable fighter. Then he directed his barrier forward and thought, didn't make it in time? Caprice asked in surprise, did it disappear? Then she turned around and said, damn. She laughed and asked, but he runs away nimbly, right? Then what will he say to this? She swung her sword several times, pointing them at her opponent. He crashed into the wall and thought, I see. Pinned to the wall means there's nowhere else to run. The protagonist directed the barrier forward and said, this time, he'll definitely put up a barrier. Caprice continued to strike and shouted, goodbye. She thought, did he close his eyes? Does he want to die? No, that's not it. The whole atmosphere changed. A second later, Oliver began to circle around his opponent. She screamed, enough of these tricks. He should fight fair and square. The protagonist thought, oh shit. It wasn't Oliver who needed the barrier. It was Caprice. At that moment, the opponent actually approached her and swung his weapon. She put her sword in front of her and asked, what's wrong? Nothing. Before she could finish speaking, she suddenly flew back and fell to the ground. The protagonist called out to her in fear. She asked, what's going on? A moment of crushing defeat. He ran up to her and tried to call out to her again. An unknown attack. She clenched her teeth and he asked, is she okay? She spat out a clot of blood, then wiped her mouth and said, well, yeah, even if it was an accident, you did a good job. Now she won't hold back either. Oliver asked, do you still want to continue? She pointed her weapon at him and screamed that she would cut off his head. The next second, Oliver stood with his eyes closed, threw his sword and thought, the atmosphere had changed again, but this time it felt completely different. He didn't know why, but he could only destroy her with all his might. Then he attacked his rival. She spat out a clot of blood again, and thought, what the hell? It was like he had become completely different. His strength had increased. She skidded to a stop on the ground, and then jumped forward, swung her weapon. She thought, when he closed his eyes, it seemed like she was fighting a different person. They wouldn't get anywhere like this. They had to solve everything with speed. and then she jumped towards him and pushed off his sword with her foot, after which she swung her weapon. Then she stopped in surprise when she realized that Oliver's hand had grabbed her by the neck. She released her sword and then fell to the ground. Oliver said, "It's time to end this." With these words, he stopped the sword near her head, then swung it. She smiled and said, "The defeated one can only accept death." The protagonist placed a barrier on her, clapped his hands and said, "Well, that's it. They both fought well. Oliver, from today on, he leads the knights." He shook his hand and said that they were glad to work with him. He asked, "Is he sure?" Caprice hit him on the back and shouted at him to take it easy. The commander of the knights. He began to cry, and the protagonist said, "After all, his strength is amazing. So that's what it is, apparently a gift." Then Azazel asked, as expected of Shield, did he know about gifts? "This is the gift of possession." He asked Azazel, "Since when is he here?" "How does he know?" "A gift is something different from magic, a power that ignores the laws of the world. His gift of possession is activated the moment he relaxes, and then it's as if someone else enters him." The protagonist thought in fear, possession. Does that mean there is a spirit living inside him? Then he added, most likely he can be possessed by more than 1,000 swordmasters. The protagonist asked, "What if there is an unsuccessful one?" He answered, "This happens quite often." Oliver asked not to be hit with a sword. Then the protagonist said, "Wasn't he too hasty in his decision?" She raised her hand with the sword and screamed, "Come on, he is the commander of the knights now." Afterwards, she hugged him, and MC said, "Well, even though she lost, Caprice is also quite strong, and he thinks that she will be useful to Oliver. They will bet on his potential and trust him for now." Then he said, "The army seems to be fine." Azazel, holding the documents in his hands, confirmed and added, "And here's another thing. He collected information on the current taxes. He asks to take a look." The protagonist looked and said, "That's right." Then he looked closely at the documents, shouted, "A tax on the birth of boys?" He said, "It seems Van taxed everything he could." After that, the protagonist tore up the documents and ordered to cancel them. He replied, "Yes." Then he added, "And also a tax on excess weight, a tax if it's cloudy on a full moon, cancel everything. According to these laws, they even charge a tax for breathing." Then Azazel pointed his finger at one of the documents and said, "There was even a tax on bad breath." The protagonist shouted in surprise, "Oh my god, cancel everything and rewrite it from scratch." Taxes, although a tax on obesity sounds fun, they'll probably leave that. Okay, then he'll take care of the taxes. In the meantime, he'll inspect the lands and put up barriers. Go with him and look for what the residents need." Azazel agreed and said that he entrusted it to him. After some time, a child ran up to the protagonist and shouted, "Wow, it's that cool guy from last time." The woman shouted in alarm, "Shin-kun, you can't say that." The protagonist smiled and said that everything is fine. She said, "What a magnanimous lord they have." One of the gathered villagers said, "Yes. Their lord is truly an amazing person. He cancelled all the senseless taxes, for which they are immensely grateful. That's wonderful. And how do they live now?" The man said joyfully with tears in his eyes, "Thanks to the Lord, everyone has become motivated. The crop yield has also increased." The girl added, "Their lord is like a deity." The protagonist scratched the back of his head, closed his eyes and said, "That's good. That's why he was worried. What if he is considered a tyrant?" They shouted that this is not so. Only those who deserved it were punished. Then the fat man said, "But about obesity," before he could finish speaking, another villager covered his mouth. The protagonist laughed. Then he heard a scream. "And he is a bastard. How dare he touch a demon child?" The little boy made a face and shouted, "The demons themselves are to blame. He entered the human village. It is not his fault." The demon man clenched his fist and shouted, "Him." At that moment, the protagonist stood in front of them and told him to wait. First, they would listen to the human's side too. The demon said, "Lord." His comrade said, "It's no use." The Lord was also a human. He wouldn't side with them. The demon objected, but he started it. He was only bullying him because he was a demon. The protagonist then walked up to the child and told him to tell them what happened. He shouted, "Demons don't belong in the human village." The protagonist replied, "It can't be helped." He then directed energy at the child and trapped him in a cube, and asked, "Does he think demons are different from humans?" He shouted, "They are different because they have weird ears, and they are different in general." The protagonist put his finger on his cheek and asked, "Is that so? But he has freckles. He is different from others." He replied then, "Since he is different from everyone else, does that mean he can't be friends with others?" The demon said yes. The protagonist asked, "Does he see?" It's not worth saying that someone can't be friends because of their appearance. He would be sad if he wasn't accepted because of his freckles, right? He confirmed. The protagonist said that to him, both humans and demons are like family, so he wants them to live in peace. Will it work? The boy agreed and the protagonist said, "Okay." After that, he pulled him out of the cube. The child approached the little demon, apologized and said that he was wrong. He said, "It's okay. They are friends now, right?" He agreed. The protagonist looked at the happy children and said, "They are so simple. It's wonderful." Then several demons happily said, "My lord." Azazel was watching what was happening and said, "Family then." After some time, the protagonist created a barrier and Azazel said, "This is the power of humans," as if watching a miracle. The protagonist asked, "Is it true?" "This is just barrier magic." He said, "Just barrier magic," he says. He confirmed it. All that was left was to connect the barriers that had already been erected, and a great power would be born. After that, several more barriers rose into the sky, protecting the buildings. Then the protagonist said, "And yet, although this is his country, it is truly beautiful." Azazel agreed with him. And then the protagonist noticed that he looked happy. He said he was really pleased that they could live in peace. After all, he did not participate in the war of the gods of his own free will. The protagonist said that he understood. That was true. He put his hand on his shoulder and added, he had worked hard this month. He replied that he was just doing his job. The protagonist gave him a thumbs up. He grinned and said that he liked his cool attitude. He knew what he had long wanted to ask. The demon asked, right? He asked, did he like it here? Was he glad that the seal was removed? He answered, how to say it. The protagonist put his hands on his waist, smiled and said, I see. Probably wants too much. Azazel smiled, but still, it was much easier for him now than it was 30 years ago. The protagonist was surprised. Did he know how to smile? He looked at him and replied that he didn't know how. Then the protagonist ran in the opposite direction, laughed and shouted, come on, we need to have a party in honor of the completion of the barrier. After a while, the man bowed his head and shouted, Akane, he's begging her. She held a lollipop in her mouth and grinned and said, even the arrogant knight captain, famous for his pride, bowed his head to you, so it really is urgent. He replied, since Game Mage hadn't returned either, that meant that only she was left. She had to bring shield. If she couldn't do it alive, a corpse would do. Then she jumped off the table and said, she didn't mind. This was a chance to learn his barrier magic, but she wasn't going to follow his orders. She would do as she wanted. The man agreed and said that he was asking her. She went to the door and said that she was looking forward to it. In the corridor, she met Elaine, who shouted in surprise, this brat, what is she doing here? Really? She ran into the room and shouted, is he really going to send this brat to shield? She is selfish, ignores orders, is completely uncontrollable. How can he be used at all? Karasari shouted indignantly, and she's so important. What can she do herself? She said that if he gives her 2 knights to accompany her, she will decide everything herself. He was surprised. What? She ran her finger over her lips and said that she has that weapon. Meanwhile, Olivier peeked out from the corner and asked, I wonder if it really takes a whole month to get to Marai? She clenched her fists and shouted, well, she is sure that she did not lose her way, so why can't she get there? Then a monster ran straight at her. She asked in surprise, what? Then she said, it must go away. At that moment, the monster's body was cut into several pieces. The old man, watching what was happening, shouted, Goddess. She looked at him and asked who he was. He said that she defeated the very monster that had been tormenting their village for years. She was like a goddess. Please, she must stay in their village for at least 1 day. She wanted to object, and then he led her forward, putting his hand on her shoulder. She said that she was busy, so only for 1 day, okay? He thanked her. And after a while, she was sitting on the throne next to a lit fire. She thought, how did this happen? The villagers were kneeling next to her and saying, blessings to the goddess who saved their village. She shouted that she had no time for such fun. They shouted, she wants to leave them? She shouted, everyone be quiet. She is going to shield. Then she heard a voice, hey. She turned around and shouted, what kind of magic is this? The voice asked, did she just say shield? He shouted, who is she? Azazel walked forward and said, they say there is a riot brewing here. Some upstart is playing queen, and with a throne at that, she took her game too seriously. She shouted indignantly, what? A riot? What is he talking about? He answered, who threatens the Lord, someone will disappear. She said who he is. Then he directed his energy at her and told her to perish in this hell. She clenched her teeth, looked at him, but his attack hit her hair, and she thought, just hit, and her hair began to rot. What kind of magic is this? He said, the magic of decay. He didn't think she would react so fast. Even if she was playing the queen, she had some ability. She jumped aside and shouted that she needed to meet Shield. He said that name again. Then he directed his energy at her and asked, would she really not give up on the rebellion as long as she was alive? She was surprised. A rebellion? Then he directed his energy forward, hitting the roof of a nearby house. Then he said, that's it, she should go to hell, and she shouted for him to wait. If he hit here, the village would suffer. She ran forward. He ran after her and shouted, is she running? And running would only lead to death. She extended her hand forward and said that she needed to get away from here first. She thought that reflecting the decomposition magic was too dangerous. She needed to find a moment and break through. From this position, the village was no longer in danger, which meant she could use all her power. Then she directed her energy threads at him and said, now the real thing begins. And he was surprised. What, did you not want to run away? What? What is this? He looked at his legs and shouted. She tied him up? She said that he chased her without a plan in vain. He grinned. She will regret not tying his hands. He directed his energy at her again. She grabbed her wounded hand and shouted, damn. He asked, which hand does she want to start with? She thought, like a burn. It will take too long to heal. It is better to retreat without prolonging the fight. At this time, a wound opened on Azazel's cheek, and he wondered where the attack was coming from. Then Olivier directed her energy at him again and said, got you. Does he know? Spider threads are about 20 times thinner than a human hair. She created exactly the same ones for magic and scattered them everywhere. If he twitches, he will lose his head. He shouted, damn. She ran on and waved her hand and shouted, he can rest there, enjoying the evening air. He snapped his fingers and said, "We must report to the lords." He summoned several bats. After some time, one of them flew up to the window where the main character was standing and he asked in surprise, "This is Azazel's bat, right? A message? What? The same goddess that even Azazel had a hard time dealing with? Why did she rebel?" The bat did not answer his questions and flew away, and he was upset. He wanted to feed them nuts. They are as serious as Azazel. After a while, the protagonist walked along the shopping street and said, "It seems that there are even more merchants." Beluga was walking next to him and said, "After the barrier appeared, trade began to develop rapidly." Then one of the residents shouted, "Lord Ruler." The protagonist said, "Beluga, she must stop. They must listen." She agreed. The man bowed and then said that he was a merchant who came across the sea and heard that the position of the head of the merchant guild was vacant. The protagonist folded his arms and said, "Didn't he say that he doesn't take bribes?" He replied, "Of course, he understands everything, but maybe the previous applicants just didn't have enough sincerity to ask properly. Sometimes you have to make empty talk about trade too. However, it's not that important." After this, he removed the cape from a huge box filled with coins. The protagonist noticed, "Wow, generous." The man thought, "The Lord Ruler of Marai is clearly simple." The protagonist then asked, "How did he manage to prepare such a sum?" Then he folded his arms and turned away, closed his eyes and said that he refuses. The man shouted in surprise, "Why?" The protagonist turned around and said, "Appointing someone to the position is an unnecessary headache." The other villagers shouted, "Wow, a real ruler." Then the protagonist turned around. They were surrounded by more villagers. They were shouting, "A real god of equality for everyone." That's right. MC said that he just wanted to see for himself how ordinary people really live. But if he was recognized right away, no one would dare to speak frankly. After all, everyone would try to please the ruler and not share their true thoughts. Well now, Beluga, she will have to help him change clothes and disguise himself. She bowed and said, "Yes." Then she extended her hand to him and said, "Ready." The protagonist looked at his reflection and shouted, "Everything is perfect." He asked, "Where is Mr. Shield?" The voice from the mirror answered, "He is here." He said, "No, he just asked." Then he waved his hand and said that he will inspect everything himself. She should come back. Beluga agreed and said, "Welcome." After that, the protagonist continued walking along the shopping street. The villager said, "This is the ruler." He said, "Like this." The villager said, "It is him." Then he straightened his beard and said that he was just a random traveler who had found himself in Marai again. How were they living here? The villagers thought desperately, "What an unconvincing actor." The rest said, "Welcome. It's all thanks to their great ruler. Everyone is happy here." Yes, it's all thanks to the holy barrier and their lord who set it up. The protagonist blushed with embarrassment and asked, "Is it true?" They confirmed it. Then Faye came up to him and asked what he was doing here. He noticed her, then asked, or rather, who was she? She folded her arms across her chest and suggested that they end this boring performance. By the way, she was tired meeting with the merchants on his account. He asked her, "She ate and drank at their expense, right?" She replied, "Well, that's not the point." On the way, they were given a letter. The elf asked to give it to him personally. The protagonist said, "He said he doesn't take bribes." She said it wasn't a bribe, it was a letter. Apparently the elf was noble, but got into trouble and barely survived. It was a state letter from the country of the elves. The protagonist unfolded the letter and said, "I see." After that, he turned around and asked, "Where is this elf now?" She said, "A magician appeared and took the elf. The name seems familiar. If she's not mistaken, Olivier." The protagonist said, "It can't be. Are you talking about Olivier?" She agreed and added about him. He thought, does that mean Olivier kidnapped the messenger sent to him? He's holding a guest from the country of the elves hostage. What is he up to? Then he said, "Okay. First of all, they will return to the castle and prepare everything necessary." After some time, he was filling out the documents. He said, "Judging by the contents of the letter, the conflict for power between people and elves could well spill over to their lands." He thought that Olivier and Caffre would be in charge of the army. They would be in charge of order and defense. As for Azazel and his work on arranging the dungeon, they would discuss this issue a little later when they had time. But first of all, it was necessary to thoroughly check all the castle's defensive structures to make sure that the defense was reliable and not ready for any surprises. Then he looked out the door and asked what that noise was. A small demon was pounding the stones with a hammer. The protagonist saw him and said that he thought that all the demons with Azazel had gone into the dungeon. The boy shouted, "Shield." After that, he threw the stone, the hammer, and sank to the ground, bowing to him. The protagonist, smiling, asked who he was. He answered, "The weakest of the demons, so Azazel left him here." He thought, "I understand, but since he is among them, it means he is not just weak." Then he asked what he has. "Why are his eyes shining like that?" He replied that he was disassembling a magic stone. He wanted to change the properties of this one. The protagonist took the stone in his hand and said to put the power and nature of magic into another object. He had never heard of such an application. I wonder. And what is he going to create? The boy thought for a moment and then said embarrassedly, he wanted to later ask the Lord Ruler through Aazel. He wanted to improve the barrier spell a little in his own way. The protagonist was surprised. "A barrier?" The boy cried and shouted. He apologizes. Still, he got too carried away. But the protagonist sat down opposite him and said that it sounded interesting. Barrier magic is top-notch. It's surprising that he was interested in it. He asked, "Right? If the shield barrier could be used by others, it would be cool." MC asked, "Really?" And how does he want to do it? He replied he remade the magic stone, now it reacts to mana. The protagonist, surprised, said, well, wow. The boy concentrated the modified stone and said, even if it is far from the shield, such a barrier will protect against any spell. The protagonist smiled and said, interesting, he should say what he wants. If he can, he will help. Then the boy added, then can he have some of his barriers, please? The protagonist raised his index finger and said, it is not difficult. After that, he stacked the barriers. The little demon was surprised. He made such a strong barrier so easily. Then he took it in his hand and said, there it is. He should wait a second. If he puts this on. The protagonist thought that he really is not that weak. The boy said that he attached his modified magic stone to the barrier. The protagonist took it in his hand and said, come on, this. He thought, just touching it, it feels like his barrier has become a wall. He turned and asked, what about physical defense? The boy replied that here he wants the barrier to react to body heat or minerals. The protagonist smiled and said, okay, he will buy magic stones on a separate budget. He will also make about 100 barriers for him. The boy was surprised. What? Then he started crying and thanking him. He doesn't even know how to thank him. The protagonist patted him on the head and said that he is waiting for the result. Then he went to the door. The boy shouted, definitely. Then he turned around and asked, by the way, Daigo, does he also do building repairs? He was surprised. What? Then he went up the stairs, holding a hammer in his hands, and the protagonist said, yes, after the last incident with Faye, everything here was torn apart. Now he doesn't know what to do. Is he a genius? He smiled awkwardly and answered, no way. This is too much. At least now there is no need to worry. At that moment, a dark aura appeared behind the boy. The protagonist shouted from behind. He jumped down and the protagonist asked, is he okay? He thought, spatial magic? Gabriel? No, it's not him. Only one has such crude magic. Akana appeared from the system space and said, oh yes. The protagonist said, so Karasari's was sent this morning. She sank down and said that it was true. The little girl practically threw herself at her feet, began to beg, but how could she refuse? She even found it funny. The protagonist said, but she is not one of those who agree to do something just because she was asked to. In fact, does she want it herself? She answered, of course. After all, Akana just loves to arrange fights, skirmishes. She pushed off the ground, jumped up. The protagonist said that then everything is clear. After that, Akana sent forward several stones and said that this time she will definitely break his barrier. She stretched out her hand and tried to put up a barrier. He covered himself with his hand and said, oh. She landed on a hill, said, it didn't work again. How come? Even a genius like Akana can do ordinary barrier magic. He told her not to say everything herself. He was already tired. She said that she thought about it. She concentrated a huge sphere of energy and asked, what if this happens? If he gets hit, then consider him dead. Daigo fearfully held onto the curtain while the sphere sucked him in. The protagonist shouted for her to stop. He just fixed everything. She jumped up and shouted, none of her business. After that, she sent energy to the protagonist, and he used a barrier, a magical reflection. The sphere returned to her, and she said in surprise, now Akana is in trouble. Then bye-bye. He thought, really, if the reflection hadn't worked, he would have been finished. Then she said, okay, now she will think about what spell to play with next. She concentrated the energy in her fingers and asked, what about this? Well, at that moment, a barrier flew at her. Daigo stood in front of the protagonist, holding barriers in front of him, and said that he would protect the Lord Ruler. She asked, who is he? He, barely standing on trembling legs, introduced himself. The protagonist thanked him, put his hand on his head, and said that he would decide everything himself from now on. Akana folded her arms across her chest and asked, hey, this is a shield barrier, right? He said, Lord Ruler. The protagonist said it was okay. He could talk. He said it was a redesigned barrier of Lord Shield connected to his magic stone. She said, interesting. Cool thing. What if we try it like this? She concentrated energy in her hands and then directed it into the floor, directing it straight at him. She clapped her hands and said, wow, even the lightning was blocked and the reaction was perfect. He replied, this is the highest shield barrier. No magic will get through. Then she directed the attack forward again and shouted, what if? The protagonist thought, is that mucus? Mucus doesn't have the magic reflection effect, so that was a good idea. Daigo dropped the barriers and said, wow, he didn't think there was such a vulnerability? Akana won. She laughed and asked, he is Daigo, right? She offered to improve it together. Then he looked at the protagonist and he said, okay. Then he called Akana. She asked, what? He said if she promised to behave well, he would let her play with Daigo too. Well, does she agree? She happily answered, yes, she will be good. The protagonist said, okay. Then to the manor. She grabbed the baby by the hand, headed into the room and shouted, let's go. He extended his hand forward and desperately told her to fix everything here at the same time. Meanwhile, the shadow stood on the roof of the building, then ran into the room to the protagonist, put her hand on the body of the protagonist. She put her hands on his head, and the protagonist thought, is the killer from Helena again? Didn't feel his presence at all. Then he put his hand forward, touched her chest. He asked in surprise, soft? It was her, Murell, the bride ready to penetrate into the very heart. She climbed on top of him and licked her lips. He shouted, what is she doing here? She asked, is he ready to accept her? Doesn't he see? She came to him for the night. She is always ready. She reached out to his ear and bit it lightly. Then he screamed loudly. At this time, Beluga ran into the room and screamed, Mr. Shield. She saw what was happening, began to close the door and asked for forgiveness. The protagonist screamed, no. Then Murell asked, aren't demons at odds with humans? Young demoness, Why does she serve him? She answered, Mr. Shield is the only exception. She was surprised. Then she came closer and ran her fingers over her lips and said how beautiful her face was. Then she turned around and shouted, Shield, he didn't touch that girl, did he? He said, of course not. She closed her eyes and said that if they looked away, someone would kidnap her. That's it. He said, well, and he, Beluga said, since Mr. Shield thinks so, she won't object. The protagonist shouted in surprise, Beluga? Then she said, that woman, people like her are the most dangerous opponent. Then she shouted, he's not sleeping with that woman? Then the protagonist shouted, he's not such a pervert. He's already asleep. After a while, he yawned, sat down in a chair. Murell was sitting opposite him and said, well, groom, it looks like he didn't get much sleep either. He shouted. Naturally, she took the mug in her hand and said, and anyway, if she had a message from the queen from the very beginning, well, she would have said so. She winked and added, it was just an excuse. In fact, she came to conceive a child with him. The protagonist raised his hand to his face, smirked, then looked at her. She asked, what is it? Is she that irresistible? He answered that it is not so. He just thought what a beautiful place it was. Then she said, after all, she is from a noble family. He thought that he would keep it a secret that he thought she was cool. Then he told her to tell him what was from the queen. She said, well, to put it briefly, Ilias is in trouble. The protagonist shouted in surprise. What? She said that it was not an immediate problem. He shouted for her not to scare him like that. She said that in the future, Marai will definitely rule the entire continent. He said it was strange for him to say this, but it was all because of the barrier. She extended her hand to the table and said, so, the kingdom of Urano and Mimicito border Marai, but Ilias is far to the north. The more people flock to one place, the more Ilias will suffer. The protagonist asked, but didn't they get a good offer from Mimicito? She answered, of course, the fact that Ilias got an ice-free port is very important. In the next 10 years, their country will be a big winner. However, the queen is looking to the future, because beastmen live longer than humans. He said, I see. He understood. And what do they want from him? He can't do anything that would upset the balance between the countries. She laughed and said that she understood. The queen wants something more direct. He clarified, direct? He wondered if she was really thinking right now. She wants to be with him. She said that the queen wants his child. He screamed in fear. What? Then she folded her arms across her chest and added, lest he misunderstand her. The queen was already over 60. When she said she wanted his child, she was talking about his pedigree. He asked, so if he had a child in the future, he should give it to Ilias? She noticed that it was true. She promised to pass the throne to his child if it was born from a union with a beastman. He smiled and said, I see. Make the child a king. A king? She had to wait. What if he was talentless? Would they still give him the throne? She said, of course. He thought, what value is there in a child who might not even be able to use barrier magic? No. As a father, he would be pleased. But sure, father. He said, if he, a human, put up a barrier for Ilias, is it because his child will live there? She said, exactly. He understood everything correctly. He thought that the offer was not bad, even more so, but simply excellent. She added, firstly, their child simply cannot be talentless, and secondly, she will train him properly. MC said that? She looked at him and asked, so he knows what to do, right? He has to take her. Shield. He blushed with embarrassment and turned away and told her to wait. He needed to collect his thoughts. She said that she understood. The groom, is he the type who prefers to be led, not to lead himself? He was surprised when she came closer to his face and took his chin with her fingers. She licked her lips and added, well, if he likes it better this way, she can take him herself. At that moment, the door closed and a scream was heard. You can't. The protagonist, looking at the girl in surprise, asked, Elaine? She smiled and noted that they had not seen each other for a long time. Beluga said that she was an envoy from the kingdom of Helen, so she has not killed her yet. She will kill her as soon as she receives the order. She said that she would like to talk to him alone. The protagonist said he does not have time to waste on her. After all, he was the ruler of the autonomous region now. She put her finger to her mouth and thoughtfully asked, where should she start? When was he planning a coup d'etat? If she should go with him? He said so, but he hadn't planned anything like that. She walked forward and added, but when the night captain asked her to search his room, she definitely found the plan there. He asked, she set this all up, right? She shouted that it wasn't so. He should believe her. She found it, but now she thinks that even this was part of the night captain's plan. He asked, seriously? So that's what it was? Beluga said that it couldn't be. The protagonist asked, what? Is she lying? Elaine covered her face and said, that's why she wanted to talk to him alone. She didn't want him to be misled by someone else's lies. She wants him to believe her. The protagonist then asked, besides the night captain, is there anyone else involved? The king, for example? She put her hand on her chest and replied, as far as she knows, this is all Carsares' plan. She extended her hand forward and added, when they return, they must expose him together. Shield, he must not trust anyone. He must take her hand, and they must return to the country together. MC looked at her hand and thought, a glove? He remembers that she said that she does not like to take off her gloves. Afterwards, he closed his eyes and said that Akana came here the other day. She asked, what is this for? He said that she used her own magic formula everywhere. When he restrained her, he saw that all the walls were covered covered in some kind of scribbles. She said, "So what?" The protagonist smiled and added, "She is very proud, so she has a habit of marking her magic formulas." Elaine thoughtfully said, "Mark," and then grabbed her hand. The protagonist smiled and said, "She completed the spatial magic with the formula left by Akana. Even if she can't use it directly, she turned it into an item with special conditions, like a magic tool." She continued to look at her hand. He asked, "Exactly?" Then she raised her hand to her face, began to laugh madly, and shouted, "For the talentless shield who can't do anything himself, he seemed to have gotten a little smarter." He asked, "Was she finally done pretending?" Then the knights came forward. One of them shouted, "If no one interferes, shield is not a big threat. They will be delayed here, and she, Elaine-sama, should put the glove on him." At this moment, Murell laughed and asked, "What are they talking about?" She said that she was asking without jokes. Murell said, "It seems they misunderstood something. Even if they don't protect him, the likes of them won't be able to leave a scratch on him, guys." The protagonist thought, "They treat him so differently. He didn't feel such a kind attitude in Helen's kingdom. I see, this is what it means to have true comrades." Then the knights charged, and one of them said, "Since it came to this, they have no choice. In any case, if they return the shield, they can force him to put up a barrier." Then they shouted, "Yes, for Lady Elaine." At that moment, Beluga stretched out her arms in front of them and launched her attack. They stopped and asked, "What happened?" "Nothing has changed. How ridiculously she swings her sword. She is not that strong." Suddenly a huge amount of rocks fell right on them. The man shouted in surprise, "What?" She said that she thought they needed to extract information from her. The protagonist mentally thanked, but his room again. At that moment, Elaine screamed, "This is all his fault. If it weren't for his barrier, her life would not have gone downhill." Murell came closer to her and said how pathetic. "Unfortunately, and because of this barrier, many more people will die, so she can continue to mourn her tragedy." She shouted indignantly, "How dare she be so impudent to her, Mrs. Elaine?" The next second, Murell hit her under the chest and threw her over her shoulder. She turned around and said that she will take this woman. "Is that okay?" The protagonist said that she can do whatever she wants. After that, the door closed, and the protagonist looked at the pile of stones and said, well, it seems that Daigo will be needed again." A few weeks later, the protagonist thanked Daigo and added that he always calls him for help. He objected. "What is he saying?" At that moment, a demon approached them and said that he brought a report. The protagonist asked what happened. He said that he reported that Elaine returned to Helen's kingdom the other day. It seemed she confessed everything and said that it was an intrigue between her and the knight captain. He was surprised. Confessed? What did Murell do to her? Then he clenched his fist and thought, but then it was over. Then he chuckled to think it could end so easily. What did he suffer for all this time? Then the demon added, and there was another important report. The protagonist looked at him in surprise. He came closer and whispered the information in his ear. The protagonist shouted in surprise, "Him?" After that, the protagonist approached the door, and the subordinate shouted, "Where is he going?" He turned around and told him to call a war council and report as soon as Azazel returned. He answered, "Yes." Shield walked down the corridor and thought, is it really time to finish him off once and for all? Before he could come to his senses, a new enemy appeared. After a while, he sat at the table and turned to Azazel, who was sitting opposite him, apologized for calling him as soon as he returned from arranging the dungeon, but he thought that they should immediately hold a meeting about the letter from the elves. In response, he agreed with him. The protagonist asked what he knew about the elf race. He answered, during the War of the Gods, they were on the side of humans and fought shoulder to shoulder with heroes from another world. In general, they are considered a peaceful people, living in harmony with the forest, spending their days reading, but if they are angered, they will be very dangerous opponents in battle. The protagonist said, I see. In fact, Azazel, while he was sleeping, the situation changed. Among the elves, someone named Idea, a dark elf, appeared, and it seems that about 50 years ago he seized power. Azazel asked, a dark elf? He confirmed it. They are a warlike faction, different from the rest of the elves. Apparently, Idea has established a reign of terror in the elven world. Azazel said, a reign of terror, as if the very nature of the race had changed. So that letter was a request to free the elves from Idea? The protagonist replied that it was not so. It was only a warning about the danger threatening the continent. The demon was surprised, that is, risking themselves. They passed this on out of pure kindness. The protagonist confirmed this. That's why he called them. He wants to save the elven messenger who delivered this letter from Olivier's hands. It just so happened that he managed to find out where Olivier and the elf are. Azazel said, I understand. Should I gather his subordinates? The protagonist said that this time he would only take him and Beluga with him. Just in case, let Coffre and Oliver be ready as reinforcements. The other demons are undoubtedly strong, but the enemy this time is too serious. The demon asked, too serious? He headed for the exit, agreed, and told him to be on guard. After some time, the demons came to his door. The protagonist left the room, and Beluga asked, as a last resort, that he defeat the enemy, even if he had to sacrifice her. He replied that he appreciated her loyalty, but he would not allow his comrade to sacrifice himself. If things took a bad turn, they would retreat. They must be prepared for that. She said yes. The next second, The protagonist kicked the door with his foot, entered the room and shouted, "And Olivier, she must stop this nonsense and return the elf." At that moment, Olivier covered herself with cloth, sat on a chair. He shouted in surprise. "Huh?" She directed energy at him, shouted for him to die. The protagonist put his hand in front of him, used barrier magic. He protected himself and his comrades. MC thought, as expected of Olivier, if not for the barrier, he would have been incinerated. Then she shouted indignantly, "How dare he peek at a naked lady?" The protagonist asked, "Is this woman?" As Aazel said, "Mr. Shield, is this the same sorceress who called herself a goddess and incited the people?" She extended her hand forward and said, "Immediately," and then she shouted in surprise, "Shield, what the hell is he doing here?" He replied that he wanted to ask. "The knight captain has already been removed. Is she still following his orders?" She replied that she is not here under his orders. He asked, "Is it because of a personal grudge?" She shouted, "Where did he get that from?" He asked, "Then why is she here?" She raised her finger to her mouth and said something, and he asked, "What?" It was completely inaudible. "Does her stomach hurt?" She replied that she says she came to him, and that's it. What's wrong? He thought, what kind of cute reaction is this? He then turned to Beluga, who said, "Well, at least she doesn't feel any evil intent." They grinned and thought, is she unhappy about something? Then Olivier turned around and added, "Well, he shouldn't look at her." She hit him on the head, and he asked, "Is she planning a surprise attack after all?" She shouted, "You fool. She's changing. Pervert." He apologized, and she got dressed. After that, the protagonist said that he had a lot of questions for her. But first, could she give him the elf? She asked. For what reason? He had just been resurrected. He needed absolute peace. The protagonist looked at the elf and thought, resurrected? She had used resurrection magic. It's not for nothing that she's called the strongest court magician. Then he said, "I see. He'll clarify again. She wasn't going to attack him." She shouted, "Why should she attack him at all?" She covered her face and added, "Rather, nothing." He smiled and said, when she was so openly embarrassed, he himself felt awkward. Then he turned around abruptly and raised his hand up and shouted, "Everyone lie down." The next second, his barrier was covered with cracks. An arrow was flying into them. The protagonist clenched his teeth and thought, what a monstrous amount of mana. But it was not enough for him not to be able to reflect it. He apologizes, but he will have to die from his own arrow. He used the barrier again. Magic reflection. Then he looked ahead in surprise and thought, what? It was not reflected, but disappeared. That light arrow was not magic. After that, Beluga shouted, "Sir, over there." There was an elf who was holding a bow in his hands. The protagonist shouted, "Dark elf. Mercenary idea." After that, he fired another arrow. Azazel pointed his hand forward and shouted, "Magic, decomposition." Olivier said, "Disappeared." He deliberately provoked them. The protagonist said, Azazel, he must send Cafe and Oliver in pursuit immediately. They must catch him before he reports information about them. He bowed and said, "Yes." Then he added, "Beluga, he wants her to stay here and guard the elf. Olivier does not need protection. She is not the type to let anyone hurt her." She said that she did not like the sound of it. He should treat her like a lady. He thought how tiresome she was. His image of Olivier was crumbling before his eyes. Although maybe it was better this way, Olivier, without knowing it, had won the support of the people, becoming either a goddess or someone else for them. And the fact that she treats him well is very valuable. After that, he came closer to her and putting his hand on her head said, "It must have been difficult for her to get here. Have you run out of money for the trip?" She replied that she got lost on the way, then lost her wallet. In general, all sorts of things happened. He said that she could rely on him in her future life and he would find her a job. She thanked him shyly, said that she had come to him for a reason after all. He laughed at this, then he raised his hand to his mouth and added, "Well, for starters, there were traces of mana on the rubble of the destroyed buildings. The demon cafe would be able to track him down by them." The others said, "Yes," he announced. They were starting a counterattack. At that moment, the dark elf landed on the roof and said, "We must quickly report to Mr. Idea." At that moment, the notes in his hands fell apart into small pieces. Caprese, standing on the roof nearby, said, "Found. The report is cancelled, okay?" Oliver added, "The game of hide-and-seek is over." The dark elf thought that he had not felt their presence at all. "We must run. Retreat." Then he jumped forward and Caprese told him not to run. She offered to fight fairly. Then she shouted, "Forward, Oliver." He thought, but he is the one with the highest rank here. After that, they ran in pursuit, and the dark elf turned around and shouted, "Damn." He pulled the bowstring and released the arrow, then shouted, "Do they really think they can resist this sacred light arrow?" Caprese flew forward, asked, "Sacred?" And this is the dark elf speaking. "Oliver, she gets the first point, okay?" The elf looked at her in surprise. She swung the weapon and shouted, "Done." She wounded her opponent, and Oliver closed his eyes, swung the huge weapon and shouted that he will not retreat either. He will finish him with one blow. At this time, he looked out the window in surprise. Caprese raised her weapon up and shouted, "What is he doing?" Then the elf shouted, "Fools, they must get it." He aimed several arrows straight at Caprese. There was a small explosion, and he said, "Now they are finished." Then he thought in surprise, she is not there? He turned around and thought, behind. She swung her weapon and noticed that he was smart, but it was too late. Of course, it will hurt excruciatingly. At that moment, she aimed a slashing attack at his stomach. He knelt down and she herself said contentedly, "It's done." He replied that it was not so yet and began to pull the bowstring. She asked, "Wow?" He still had the strength to move? After that, he finally released the arrow. Caprese pointed her hand forward and thought, "This is the direction." She shouted, "Oliver, Oliver's sword is still powerful." The elf grinned and shouted, What can a pathetic little man do? After that, Oliver asked who he was talking to. He jumped out of the explosion, holding his weapon. The elf shouted in surprise, "What?" Oliver was approaching him at lightning speed. Caprice turned around and said, "Finally got the right one." He replied, "Yeah, made them wait." He thought, what a comeback. Then he delivered a powerful blow, lifting the elf into the air and then let go. The elf looked around in surprise and thought, where is he? He can't see him. At that moment, Oliver swung his weapon behind him and delivered a powerful attack, sending him flying straight to the ground. Caprice came down and said, "Hey Oliver, did you decide to take all the glory for yourself?" She stepped on the dark elf and told him to get some sleep. Good night. After that, he closed his eyes. After a while, Caprice shouted, he should be walking normally. They dragged the elf to the protagonist. The protagonist folded his arms over his chest and asked, "Is he still in one piece?" Faye laughed and said, "Dark elves really do have an incredible amount of mana." She crouched down and extended her finger to him and asked, "I wonder what would happen if I ate him?" The protagonist asked, "Did he hear?" "He should tell them everything he knows and they won't eat him alive, no matter what." He shouted, "No way." At that moment, Caprice shouted, "Sir, he should praise her. It's all her merit." Oliver was useless. The protagonist looked at Oliver and asked, "Really?" He scratched his head and confirmed it, then apologized. He was unlucky at the beginning of the fight. Well, Caprice definitely won't lose in a speed contest. Obviously, it's impossible to withstand a blow at that speed. The protagonist then put his hand on her head and said, "Good job. She really is excellent," she said happily. The master praised her. The protagonist thought, she is the only one of the demons who started with a defeat, so perhaps he was unknowingly underestimating her. She shouted, "Did he hear? She was praised." He felt a little awkward, and then he asked, "By the way, how was it to fight him?" She replied, "By the way, he didn't seem to notice Oliver's presence. He reacted to her movement, but Oliver missed it." The protagonist said, "Usually Caprice, superior in speed, harder to notice." She asked, "Does he see?" And Oliver, "They have a brainless jock who doesn't use mana." The protagonist thought, "That's right, mana." And indeed, he was aiming at the elven message through the wall of the building. Then he said, "I see. So he has developed the ability to sense mana. Okay, Caprice, he assigns her to deal with the dark elves hiding in their lands. She must fight, suppressing her mana." At that moment, Oliver grabbed his hand and shouted, "Sir, he must give him a task, at least some." He replied that he must first practice, draw a lucky ticket with his ability. As it turns out, so will he. They will assign the dark elves. He said desperately, "But why?" The next second, the dark elf asked, "Are they done chatting?" Then he aimed his arrow forward and pulled the bowstring. After the protagonist said that he did not expect that he still had the strength to resist, but since he spoke, it means he is only a third-rate opponent. The elf said, since he can't convey the information, he will destroy the enemies of Mr. Idea at the cost of his life. After that, he aimed and fired an arrow forward and shouted, "He must die. Shield!" Caprice ran forward, covering the protagonist, but the protagonist caught the arrow the next second. The others shouted in surprise, "What?" He looked at the arrow in his hands and smiled and said, "I see." The elf shouted in surprise, "Why? This attack shouldn't have been stopped by a normal barrier." He replied, "That's what he thought. The last time he tried to reflect it, nothing worked, because this is not magic but mana itself." The people present were surprised. "Mana itself?" He replied, "That's right. It seems he attacked with compressed mana." Then he raised his hand to his head and continued. He had to work hard to adjust the barrier so that it wouldn't break. Well, the test is over, so perhaps it's time to return it to its owner. With these words, he threw an arrow forward, hitting the elves exactly, from which they began to disappear. After he said, "Then it is decided, against the dark elves they will use mana reflections." Azazel, taking this into account, he must reorganize their troops. He replied, "Yes." The protagonist added, "Minant is also close. Gabriel must be informed. He must send a message to Minant. He can send any suitable person there. The demons are excellent, but there are few of them. He does not want to waste them in vain." Azazel said, he has a small suggestion about this. The protagonist asked, "What is it?" After a few moments, the protagonist said, "Then select people, and for this, he must order them all to be brought." He bowed and said that he obeys. Faye put her hand to her face and said, "He is going to call them. It seems that it will be interesting." After that, the protagonist walked along the corridor and wished the maids a good morning. He thought, the military power has stabilized, it remains to sort out the equipment. How are things going with Daigo and the others' accounts? He looked at the room with the door open in surprise. He said, "Faye, that's enough. All you can do is eat. She should help." She asked, "What is he talking about?" She was working hard too. Brooks put his hands on the chair and said, "Oh, it's the ruler. He apologizes for the intrusion, and his name is Brooks." The protagonist said, "A familiar name." Faye said, "This guy is incredible. He can get anything." The protagonist walked closer and said, "Sure. This is the merchant Faye was fleecing." He sat down at the table and said, he heard Faye gave him a hard time the other day. He must have incurred a lot of expenses. He replied that it was such a small thing. The protagonist said, yes, it had turned out badly. He replied that it had not. Then the protagonist looked away and added, in any case, they should talk over food. He would order the maids to prepare everything. Brooks touched it and said, in that case. He unwrapped the package and said that he had with him a precious set of gold tableware brought from distant lands. The protagonist took a spoon in his hand and said, wow. This is truly a top-quality item. He had never seen anything like it. He stuck his fork into a piece of meat. looked closer and said, "The meat has cooled down a bit. I would like to add some flavor to it." The merchant took out a bottle and said, "In that case, how about truffle oil?" With these words, he dumped the contents onto the piece of meat. The protagonist asked, "How does he even get such things?" He replied that nothing is impossible for him. Faye held a shell in her hands and said, "That's right, that's right. He also trades by sea. They say he has several merchant ships, and he seems to be an expert in shipbuilding." The protagonist thought in surprise, "Shipbuilding? Marai already has access to the sea. If they can get warships, they will gain an advantage in the war with the Dark Elves." Then he said that now he understands why Faye introduced him so confidently. Brooks spread his arms out to the sides and said, very flattered, "In fact, he has even been to the Island of Elves." The protagonist was surprised. "To the Island of Elves? Is this true?" He folded his arms across his chest and confirmed this, of course, and more than once. His specialty is that he never forgets the route he has taken. The protagonist smiled and said, "In that case, he should listen. Does he like children?" After a while, they came to the children, and the protagonist waved his hand, greeting them. Akane walked forward and said, "Shield, it's just great here. She has so much fun every day." He said that this is the most important thing. He is glad that she is not wild. Then he patted Daigo on the head, and he thanked him for coming to such a place. Brooks said, "These kids?" The protagonist turned around and said, "These kids are currently learning barrier magic." Lumiere folded her arms and said, "Akane shouldn't rest, she needs to keep training." She replied, "Okay, but this isn't training, she's just playing." Then she shouted, "Here." With these words, she sent several streams of energy forward. Lumiere also put her hands in front of her, dispelling it. The protagonist said, "The power is still the same." Daigo reached for the crystals and shouted, "So." The protagonist said, "Wow, they clearly assigned roles." After that, Akane, pointing her finger to her side, said, "This guy's barrier is incredible. Not as good as his, but maybe even stronger than Akane's." The protagonist was surprised. "That's interesting." She said, "It's natural. After all, she will become the ruler of Marai." After that, she concentrated the energy in her hands and asked, "But how can she do it?" Fireball. Lumiere put her hands in front of her and used barrier, water attribute enhancement. The protagonist raised his hand to his mouth and asked in surprise, "Wow, I see," he thought. So, in order to increase the barrier's strength, she gives it an attribute opposite to attack. Such a trick is only possible because she has an affinity for different types of magic. She asked, "Can he teach her another magic?" The protagonist folded his arms across his chest and answered, "No. She will continue to study barrier magic." She shouted at him not to mock. He folded his arms and answered, "Be quiet. The right to decide whether she lives or dies belongs to him." She looked at him desperately, and then Akane asked, "Is she done?" She shouted that it is not so. She will surpass him in barrier magic. Daigo raised his hand and shouted happily, "Great, Ms. Akane, please. She must hit here once too." With these words, he took out several barriers. He watched what was happening and asked what kind of defenses were floating in the air. The protagonist said that they were automatic shields. It seemed as if they were just playing. In fact, it helps to steadily increase their military power. He shouted in surprise. They were still children, but this was simply incredible. He, who had visited all corners of the world for the sake of trade, was in this form for the first time. The protagonist asked, "Is that it?" He looked at him in surprise and asked, "So why did they introduce him to these children?" He answered, "It was in order to create a secret weapon for the coming Great War."